Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The fluorescent lights in the kitchen hummed with that particular frequency that burrowed into your skull around 3 in the morning. I'd worked the night shift at Meadowbrook Rest Home for 8 months, long enough to know every creak in the floorboards, every shadow that stretched across the linoleum when the moon hit the windows just right. Long enough to know that the silence in these places isn't really silence at all. It's a waiting thing, thick and patient. I was prepping the breakfast carts when the timer went off at 4:57 a.m. Not the one I'd set. The automated prep station, a newer addition management had installed last year to optimize meal efficiency, chimed its mechanical notification. The digital display glowed blue in the pre-dawn darkness. Tray 7B ready. Tray 7B. I hadn't programmed anything. The compartment slid open with a pneumatic hiss, revealing a perfectly arranged setting. 2 slices of wheat toast, lightly browned, a small ceramic cup of black coffee, steam still rising in delicate spirals, a pat of butter on a chilled dish. Everything positioned with mechanical precision on the beige meal tray. My hands were shaking as I stared at it. I'd prepared this exact arrangement hundreds of times before, but never for the machine to do it on its own. The prep station wasn't even sophisticated enough for automatic scheduling. It required manual input for each tray, each specification entered by hand into the touchscreen interface. I checked the screen. No logged inputs. No scheduled tasks. Just that blinking message. Tray 7B ready. The logical part of my brain, the part that still functioned at 5 in the morning after 8 hours of peeling potatoes and portioning oatmeal, suggested a glitch. A software malfunction. Maybe some corrupted data from yesterday's shift that had triggered a delayed command. But I knew what this tray was. I knew because I'd made it every morning for the past 3 months, ever since Mrs. Vera Ashwood had started appearing in my kitchen before dawn. She'd shuffle in around 5:15, always wearing that same faded blue robe with the coffee stain on the left lapel, her white hair pinned back in a style that belonged to a different era. She never asked for anything, just settled herself at the small metal table by the window and waited while I prepared her breakfast. Toast and black coffee, no sugar, butter on the side. We'd talk, or rather, she'd talk and I'd listen while I worked. She told me about her husband who'd worked the steel mills in Youngstown before they closed, about her garden that used to sprawl across 2 acres, about her daughter in California who called every Sunday. Her voice had this quality like old paper, thin and delicate, but you could tell it used to be stronger. Yesterday, I'd made her tray as usual at 4:57, left it on the table by the window. I'd watched her pass by the doorway to the kitchen around 5:10, seen her profile against the dim corridor lights. She'd glanced in, caught my eye, and smiled. That same gentle, knowing smile she always gave me. Then she'd continued down the hall toward the common room. But she never came to the kitchen. I'd waited until 6:30, then checked the tray. Untouched. The coffee had gone cold. The butter had started to soften in its dish. The toast sat there like an accusation. That's when I'd pulled up the corridor camera footage on the security monitor in the staff office. I'd learned how to access it a few months back when management wanted us to verify meal delivery times. The digital timestamp ticked through 5:08, 5:09, 5:10, 5:11. The hallway remained empty. The motion sensors didn't trigger. Nothing moved except the barely perceptible sway of a ceiling vent's shadow. I'd watched it 3 times, my coffee going cold in my own cup, before I checked the resident log. Vera Ashwood, room 7B. Status, transferred, 3:47 p.m. previous day. The note attached to her file was brief. Family-initiated relocation to memory care facility in Columbus. Effective immediately. Personal effects removed 4:15 p.m. That was yesterday afternoon, 16 hours before I'd seen her walk past my kitchen. Now standing in front of the prep station with its glowing blue display and perfectly arranged tray, I felt something cold settle into my chest. The kitchen suddenly seemed larger, the shadows in the corners deeper. The hum of the refrigerator sounded like breathing. I took the tray. My hands moved on autopilot, carrying it to the same metal table by the window where she used to sit. I set it down carefully, arranged the butter dish just so, turned the coffee cup handle to the left the way she preferred. Then I stepped back and waited. The window reflected my own face, pale and underlit by the kitchen's harsh fluorescence. Behind me, the empty room stretched into darkness. The clock on the wall ticked toward 5:15. Nothing happened. Of course, nothing happened. What had I expected? I was standing in an industrial kitchen at 5 in the morning, talking to ghosts and waiting for a woman who'd been transferred to a memory care facility 50 miles away. The rational part of my mind screamed that I needed sleep, needed to finish my shift and go home and forget about automated prep stations and corridor cameras and empty trays. But I couldn't shake the image of her walking past the doorway, the way she'd looked at me, smiled. The absolute certainty I'd felt in that moment that she was real, solid, present. I forced myself to finish my shift, prepared the regular breakfast trays for the 63 remaining residents, delivered them on schedule, cleaned the kitchen, restocked supplies, filled out the log sheets. Normal tasks, normal routine, except I kept glancing at that metal table by the window, at the untouched tray with its cold coffee and hardening toast. At 6:45, I threw it away. The next morning, it happened again. 4:57 a.m. The prep station chimed. Tray 7B ready. This time I didn't touch it. I stood 5 feet back and watched the compartment slide open, revealing the same arrangement. Toast, coffee, butter, steam rising. Everything fresh and hot, as if invisible hands had just prepared it. I checked the interface logs. Nothing. No inputs, no scheduled tasks, no explanation. The screen was blank, except for that blinking notification. My supervisor, Gene, arrived at 6:30 for the morning briefing. I showed him the tray, explained about the automated system triggering without input. He scratched his jaw, peered at the prep station like it might explain itself, then shrugged with the particular indifference of a man 3 years from retirement. Probably a short in the circuit board, he said. These new systems, they're more trouble than they're worth. I'll put in a maintenance request. He didn't ask why I hadn't just turned it off. Didn't ask why the tray was still sitting there, untouched, hours after it had been prepared. He just marked something on his clipboard and moved on to discuss portion sizes for the lunch service. That night, I tried to disable the prep station entirely, unplugged it from the wall. The next morning at 4:57, it chimed anyway, running on some internal battery I didn't know existed. The compartment opened. The tray appeared. I began to dread that sound. The mechanical chime, the pneumatic hiss. I'd arrive at 9 p.m. for my shift and work through the night with a growing tension in my shoulders, watching the clock tick toward dawn. At 4:50, I'd stop whatever I was doing and just stand there, waiting, knowing what was coming but unable to prevent it. 3 nights, 4, a week. Every morning at 4:57, without fail, the system prepared tray 7B, and every morning, I set it on the table by the window. I didn't know why, couldn't explain it to myself in any rational terms. But the alternative, throwing it away immediately, ignoring it, pretending it wasn't happening, felt wrong in a way that made my skin crawl, like disrespecting something I didn't understand, like breaking a rule I couldn't articulate. The kitchen began to feel different around that time. The hour between 4:30 and 5:30 took on a quality of unreality, as if I'd slipped sideways into some parallel version of my shift where the normal rules didn't quite apply. The fluorescent lights seemed dimmer. Sounds became muffled, distant. I'd catch myself standing still for minutes at a time, staring at nothing, thinking about Vera Ashwood and her faded blue robe, and the way she used to hold her coffee cup with both hands. Other staff started to notice. Not the tray, I made sure to dispose of it before anyone else arrived, but something about me, the way I jumped when someone entered the kitchen unexpectedly, the dark circles under my eyes, my habit of checking the corridor cameras during breaks, scanning the empty hallways for movement that was never there. "You doing okay?" Lisa from the day shift asked one morning as we overlapped during her early arrival. "You look like you've seen a ghost." The phrase made something inside me go very still. "Just tired," I said. "Been having trouble sleeping." She nodded sympathetically, but I saw the concern in her eyes. The way she glanced toward the table by the window, then back at me. Like she wanted to ask something, but thought better of it. I started researching the prep station, found the manufacturer's website, downloaded the technical manual, pored over wiring diagrams and software specifications during my breaks, looking for some explanation, some mechanical reason why it would activate on its own. The system didn't have scheduling capabilities, didn't have any autonomous functions at all. It was a glorified hot plate with a timer. You input your specifications manually, pressed start, and it heated and assembled the components. That was it. No AI, no learning algorithms, no possible way for it to remember a routine and repeat it. Yet every morning at 4:57, it prepared the same tray. I began to feel watched, not by cameras or security systems, but by something patient and invisible that lingered in the spaces between thoughts. I'd be chopping vegetables and suddenly know, absolutely know, that something was standing behind me. I'd spin around to find the kitchen empty, but the sensation would persist, raising the hair on the back of my neck. The corridor outside my kitchen became a source of constant anxiety. I'd see movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that shifted against the grain of the light. Several times I could have sworn I saw her, just a glimpse, a flash of faded blue fabric disappearing around a corner. But when I checked the cameras, the hallways were always empty. Was I losing my mind? The question circled in my thoughts during the long pre-dawn hours. Lack of sleep could cause hallucinations, paranoia, distorted perceptions. I'd read about that. 8 months of night shifts, the isolation, the monotony. Maybe it was finally catching up to me. But the tray was real. The prep station was real. Other people had seen it, touched it, confirmed its existence. That wasn't a hallucination. 2 weeks after the first incident, I did something I'm still not sure was wise. I checked Vera Ashwood's file more thoroughly, digging through the administrative records I technically wasn't supposed to access. Found the contact information for the memory care facility in Columbus. I called during my break at 2 a.m., when I knew only night staff would answer. Asked to speak with someone about a former Meadowbrook resident who'd been transferred to their facility. The nurse who picked up sounded tired. "We don't have a Vera Ashwood here," she said after checking their system. "Are you sure you have the right facility?" My mouth went dry. She was transferred on the 23rd, from Meadowbrook Rest Home in... I'm showing no intake on that date. No Ashwood in our current residence or our recent admissions. You might want to double-check your records. I hung up and sat in the break room, staring at the wall. The fluorescent light overhead flickered in a rhythm that almost sounded like Morse code. Outside the window, the Ohio darkness pressed against the glass like something trying to get in. I pulled up Meadowbrook's records again. Vera Ashwood, room 7B. Status, transferred. But transferred where? To what facility? The file listed the Columbus Memory Care Center, but they'd never received her. Her daughter's contact information was there, a California number. I stared at it for a long time before deciding I couldn't make that call. Couldn't explain why the night cook at her mother's former rest home was calling at 2 a.m. to ask about a transfer I had no business questioning. The next morning I arrived at the kitchen to find the table by the window already occupied. My heart stopped, but it was just Eleanor Hendricks from room 4A, an insomniac who sometimes wandered the halls before dawn. She sat with her back to me, wrapped in a burgundy shawl, staring out at the darkness. "Sorry," I said, my voice rough with adrenaline. "Didn't know anyone was in here." She turned, and her face looked strange in the pre-dawn light. Familiar but not, like a photograph slightly out of focus. "The coffee's getting cold," she said, gesturing at the table in front of her. There was no coffee. The table was empty. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes, she was gone. The table was empty. The entire kitchen was empty. The clock on the wall showed 4:45, too early for Eleanor to be up. Too early for the breakfast prep to have started. I was standing in the middle of the kitchen with no memory of the past few minutes. No idea if I'd actually seen her or if I'd been dreaming on my feet. The prep station chimed at 4:57. Same tray, same arrangement. The compartment opened with its familiar hiss. I took the tray to the window table, set it down, stepped back. This time, I spoke out loud. "I don't understand what you want." The kitchen didn't answer. The coffee continued to steam. The butter sat in its chilled dish, perfect and untouched. I left it there and went back to work, preparing the regular breakfast trays with mechanical precision. My hands knew the motions so well I didn't have to think about them. Toast, coffee, butter, over and over. The same meal I'd made hundreds of times, the same arrangement the prep station created every morning at 4:57. The same meal Vera Ashwood used to eat. At 5:15, I glanced at the table. The tray was untouched. At 5:20, still untouched. At 5:30, I looked again and felt something cold slide down my spine. The coffee cup had been moved, just slightly, rotated so the handle pointed right instead of left. The butter had been used. I could see the knife marks in it, the way it had been spread across one of the toast slices. I checked the security cameras. I was the only person in the kitchen. Had been for the past 2 hours. The logical explanations were crumbling. Equipment malfunctions couldn't move coffee cups. Software glitches couldn't spread butter on toast. And I couldn't trust my own perceptions anymore. Couldn't be certain whether I'd seen Eleanor Hendricks or dreamed her. Whether I'd moved that cup myself without remembering. Whether any of this was happening outside my deteriorating mind. I've considered quitting. Thought about it every night as I drive home in the gray dawn light, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. But something keeps me coming back. Maybe it's the fear that leaving won't stop it, that I'll be making breakfast in my own kitchen one morning and hear that chime, see that tray appear. Or maybe it's something else. Something about unfinished business, about obligations to people who might not exist anymore, if they ever really did. Last night, I brought my phone to work, set it to record video at 4:50 a.m., positioned it to capture the table by the window. I thought maybe if I could document what was happening, or not happening, I could prove to myself whether this was real or breaking down. This morning I watched the footage. At 4:57 the prep station chimes. I take the tray to the table. I set it down. I step back and wait. The timestamp ticks through the minutes. 5:10, 5:15. At 5:17, something moves in the frame. Not a person, just a distortion in the air, like heat shimmer or the way space bends around something you're not supposed to see directly. It hovers near the table for 3 seconds. Then the coffee cup rotates. The butter dish shifts. One slice of toast develops those spreading marks, as if invisible fingers are working the butter across its surface. I've watched it 20 times now. The video is clear. The timestamp is accurate. I didn't imagine it, but I don't know what it proves. Tonight, I'll go back to work. At 4:57 a.m., the prep station will chime. Tray 7B will be ready. I'll set it on the table by the window and wait to see what happens. Maybe Vera Ashwood is still there, trapped in some routine she can't break, coming to the kitchen every morning out of habit or hope or something else I can't comprehend. Maybe the prep station is responding to something, some residual energy, some echo of 3 months of the same breakfast prepared at the same time for the same person. Or maybe I've been alone this whole time, watching myself unravel in the fluorescent glow of an empty kitchen, creating phantoms to explain the inexplicable fact that nothing makes sense anymore. And I can't tell the difference between memory and imagination, between the living and whatever comes after. The only thing I know for certain is that at 4:57 a.m. tomorrow, the prep station will chime, and I'll be there to hear it. I always am. Story 2. The closet door doesn't creak when it moves. That's the worst part. I discovered this 3 weeks after moving into the house on Saguaro Ridge, one of those sprawling gated communities that multiplied across the Phoenix outskirts like architectural tumors. The kind of place where every house looked identical from the street, where the HOA sent passive-aggressive letters about mailbox angles, where silence pressed against the windows after sunset like something physical and hungry. The master bedroom closet was a walk-in, unnecessarily large for a single man with minimalist tendencies. 8 feet deep, 6 feet wide, with mirror-paneled sliding doors that reflected the bedroom in double darkness. The previous owners had left it empty except for a faint smell. Not unpleasant exactly, but organic, like soil after rain or breath held too long in cupped hands. I kept the door closed. Always closed. Until the night I forgot. Sleep paralysis wasn't new to me. I'd experienced it sporadically since college. That suffocating awareness of consciousness trapped in an unresponsive body, the pressure on the chest, the certainty of malevolent presence just beyond vision's edge. But those episodes had been random, scattered across years like isolated incidents with no pattern. Here the pattern emerged with mathematical precision. Door closed, dreamless sleep, 8 hours of oblivion. Door open even an inch. Paralysis. I documented it obsessively in my phone's notes app, timestamps and details, searching for variables I might have missed. Weather conditions, meal times, stress levels, ambient temperature, nothing else correlated. Only the door. The first time it happened, I woke at 3:08 a.m. according to the nightstand clock's green digits. My body was a stone sarcophagus, lungs working in shallow gasps against invisible weight. The bedside lamp cast its cone of amber light across rumpled sheets, creating a perimeter of safety that ended precisely at the bed's edge. Beyond that perimeter, the closet. The door stood 6 inches ajar, revealing a vertical slice of darkness that seemed thicker than ordinary shadow, more substantial, and in that darkness, at head height, a lighter patch of gray that suggested shape, suggested form, suggested the pale oval of a face pressed close to the gap, forehead against the door's inner surface. Waiting. The paralysis broke after what felt like hours, but was probably 90 seconds. I lurched upright, gasping, and kicked the door shut with enough force to rattle the mirror panels. My hands shook as I wedged a storage box against it. Irrational, since it slid open on tracks, but the gesture felt necessary. I told myself it was hypnopompic hallucination, the brain's misfiring in that twilight zone between sleep and waking. Perfectly normal, explainable. The second time, I saw the condensation. Same time, 3:08 a.m. That specificity bothered me more than it should have. Same paralysis. Same sensation of being observed by something patient and methodical. But this time, in the thin strip of mirror visible through the gap, I could see moisture beading on the glass's interior surface, fog creeping across reflective silver like frost patterns, like the breath ghosts we made as children against winter windows. Someone was breathing in there. Something was breathing in there. I started sleeping with the door firmly closed, box pushed against it, sometimes adding shoes, books, whatever weight I could justify. The paralysis stopped. I slept. I convinced myself I'd solved the problem through simple environmental control. 2 weeks of peace. 2 weeks of telling myself Phoenix's dry heat had simply created some weird condensation effect, that stress from the move had manifested in vivid dreams, that there was nothing in the closet but hanging space and childhood fears given form by an overactive amygdala. Then came game night. I'd invited 3 guys from work, new friendships, tentative, built on lunch breaks and small talk about weekend plans. We'd bonded over a shared interest in board games, those complex Euro-style strategy affairs that required 3 hours and multiple beers. It felt good to have people in the house, to fill the silence with laughter and trash talk, to prove the space could hold normal human activity. The one whose name I can't bring myself to write suggested hiding for a jump scare. We'd been drinking, loosened up, and the idea seemed hilarious in that moment. He was the prankster of the group, always pushing boundaries, always needing to be the center of attention. When he announced he was hiding and we should come find him, we rolled our eyes and continued setting up the next game. I assumed he'd chosen the bathroom or the garage, somewhere obvious. 5 minutes passed. 10. We called out, joking about how bad his hiding spot must be. 15 minutes. The jokes acquired an edge. I walked through the house, checking rooms, my voice echoing off the 2 new walls with their 2 white paint. I found him in the master bedroom. He'd emerged from the closet already, That's important. I didn't see him come out, didn't witness whatever happened inside that 8 by 6 foot space. I just found him sitting on the floor beside my bed, back pressed against the nightstand, staring at nothing with eyes that had seen everything. His face had gone the color of old newspaper. Sweat plastered his hair to his forehead despite the AC's steady 68 degrees. He was making a sound, not crying exactly, but a kind of rhythmic whimpering that came from somewhere deep in his chest. I asked what was wrong, asked multiple times, with increasing urgency. The other two had followed me upstairs, their expressions shifting from amusement to concern, to something approaching fear. He wouldn't speak. Couldn't. Maybe. He just shook his head in these tiny, rapid movements, like negation itself had become a nervous tic. When I reached out to touch his shoulder, he flinched so violently he cracked his head against the nightstand's corner. He left without his jacket, without his phone, without saying goodbye to anyone. Walked straight down the stairs and out the front door into the October night. One of the others followed him, came back 15 minutes later saying he'd driven home in silence, that when pressed for explanation, he'd said he needed to not be in this house anymore, needed to never be in this house again, needed us to please not call him about it. We haven't heard from him since. He quit the job 3 days later via email. The closet door was open when I went back to close it. Open wider than 6 inches, fully slid back, revealing the entire mirrored interior. And on that mirror, the one that lined the back wall and should have reflected my face, my bedroom, my normal fucking life. Fog. Condensation spread across the glass in a pattern that wasn't random, almost like handprints, palm-sized patches of moisture with finger-width streaks radiating outward. Almost like someone had pressed both hands against the mirror from the inside, which was impossible because there was no inside. It was a mirror flush against drywall. There was no space for anyone to be inside. I stopped thinking about it, forced myself to stop. That night, I didn't sleep. The next night either. By the third night, exhaustion made the decision for me. I passed out around midnight, fully clothed on top of the covers. 3:08 a.m. The closet light was on. I jerked awake to harsh fluorescent brightness spilling from the doorway. The door itself stood completely open. Both panels slid back to their full extension. The light fixture, a simple ceiling-mounted LED that I rarely used, burned with the kind of intensity that made my retinas ache. I knew I hadn't turned it on. I knew I'd closed the door. I knew these things the way you know your own heartbeat, fundamental and undeniable. The light switch was inside the closet, one of those proximity sensors that activated with a wave of the hand. You had to be standing beneath it, in the closet, to trigger it. I got out of bed. Every muscle screamed against the movement, adrenaline and terror warring with the basic human need to understand, to verify, to make sense of sensory input. I approached the doorway with the careful steps of someone navigating a minefield. The mirror gleamed wet. Fresh condensation covered every reflective surface, so thick it ran in rivulets down the glass like the closet was weeping. The air inside felt different, warmer, more humid, laden with that organic smell I'd noticed the first day, now intensified to something almost rotten. And in the fog, written at chest height on the back mirror, "Not alone." 2 words. Finger drawn through condensation, the letters uneven but deliberate, the final E trailing off as if the writer had been interrupted or had simply stopped caring about completion. I slammed the door shut, killed the bedroom light, grabbed my keys and spent the rest of the night at a 24-hour diner, drinking coffee until the sun came up and reality felt solid again. But reality doesn't feel solid anymore. I've started documenting everything. Times, temperatures, atmospheric pressure from a weather app, lunar phases, electromagnetic field readings from a cheap detector I bought online. I've installed a camera pointed at the closet door, motion activated, cloud backup enabled. The footage shows nothing. The door stays closed on camera, perfectly still, even when I wake to find it open. The timestamp jumps, 3:07:58 to 3:08:47, missing those crucial 49 seconds like someone edited them out, or like time itself skips in that space. I've tried staying awake through 3:08 a.m., forcing my eyes open, watching the door with the dedication of a sentry. But there's always a blink, always a momentary lapse. And in that fraction of consciousness, the door opens, the light turns on, the mirror fogs. Last night I finally opened the closet at 3:09 a.m., while the condensation still glistened. The message had changed. Closer now, I'm writing this at 2:47 a.m. I've been staring at the closed closet door for 6 hours, watching the gap beneath it for any suggestion of light, listening for any sound of movement. The house settles around me with creaks and sighs that might be foundation shift or might be footsteps, breath, presence. In 14 minutes, something will happen, something that has been happening, that maybe has always been happening, that I only started noticing when I moved into this house, but that might have been there all along, following me through apartments and relationships and cities, waiting for the right door, the right mirror, the right moment of recognition. The mirror in my bathroom has been fogging lately too. So has the rearview mirror in my car, the glass of picture frames, any reflective surface in my peripheral vision. Always that same organic warmth, that sense of something standing just behind the reflection, pressing close, breathing. I researched the house's history. 3 previous owners in 8 years. Each stayed less than 18 months. The realtor's records listed the reasons for selling: job relocation, family emergency, personal circumstances. All vague, all immediate. I tried to contact them, left messages, sent emails. Only one responded, a woman who'd lived here in 2019. She said she didn't remember much about the house, that she'd been going through a difficult time and the details were blurry. But she did remember having vivid dreams and trouble sleeping, and a closet in the master bedroom that she'd eventually had boarded up because... The message ended there. She never sent a follow-up, never answered my subsequent questions. 2:53 a.m. The temperature has dropped 5 degrees in the last 10 minutes. I can see my breath now, though the thermostat still reads 68. The air tastes like copper and soil. I'm going to open the door before 3:08. I've decided this. Whatever is happening, I need to meet it on my terms, not wait for paralysis to trap me in bed while something presses its forehead against the inside of the door and watches me with patience that feels geological, inevitable. My hand is on the door handle. The metal is warm, body temperature, like someone just released their grip. 2:58 a.m. I'm sliding it open. The closet is deeper than it should be. I can see that immediately, even though it makes no architectural sense. The back wall, the one with the mirror, appears to be receding, stretching backward into impossible space. The reflection shows my bedroom, my bed, my lamp, everything exactly as it should be. Except I'm not in the reflection. The room is empty, the bed unmade. Yes, showing the depression where my body should be sitting. But no me. No person holding a phone, typing frantically, trying to document what might be the last coherent thoughts before what? The condensation is forming again, spreading across the glass like ice crystals blooming in time-lapse. But it's not random. It's moving in patterns, deliberate sweeps that suggest intelligence, purpose, communication. It's writing something. Always here, always watching, always waiting. And beneath those words, forming slowly as I watch, hands trembling, breath shallow. Your turn, 3:08 a.m. 3:08. The closet light turns on without being touched. The door slides fully open. The mirror shows my reflection now, but it's standing inside the closet, staring out at me, one pale hand pressed against the glass from the inside. Its mouth moves. My mouth moves. Speaking words I can't hear through the barrier, through the silver backing, through whatever membrane separates the space I think I occupy from the space I've always occupied. I understand now why my former coworker couldn't speak, why he left without explanation, why the previous owners fled. Some recognitions are too large for language, some truths too fundamental for the architecture of sanity to support. I'm setting my phone down on the nightstand, screen still glowing with these words. If someone finds this, if I find this tomorrow, confused about the gaps in my memory, about why I'm so tired, about what happened during those missing hours. The figure in the mirror is stepping forward, through the glass, into the room, into me. We're pressing our foreheads together now. The me that thinks it's real and the me that knows better. The boundary is thinner than I imagined. Thin as condensation. Thin as breath. The door will close soon. I know this with certainty. It will close, and I will wake up at 8 a.m. confused about why I slept on top of the covers, why my phone battery is dead, why there's fog on every mirror in the house, and tomorrow night, I'll close the closet door carefully before bed. I'll make sure it's latched, secured, protected, because now I know what's really in there. Now I know what's been staring back. And tomorrow night, when someone, something, some version of consciousness wearing my face, wakes up at 3:08 a.m. to find the closet door open, finds the light on, finds condensation spreading across the mirror with a message taking shape, they'll finally understand why the paralysis feels familiar, why the presence feels like recognition, why the forehead pressed against the inside of the door is warm. The door is closing now. The light is going out. The mirrors are clearing. I'm forgetting already. But part of me, the part that presses its forehead against doors, that fogs mirrors with impossible breath, that waits patiently in spaces between spaces, that part remembers everything. That part is always here. That part is reading these words right now, trying to remember what it felt like to be afraid, what it felt like to be on the outside, what it felt like to believe that doors and mirrors and the space behind reflections were separate from the self. The closet is closed. Good night. Story 3. The first time I heard my mother's voice in the stairwell, I was convinced someone had broken in. 1:17 a.m. The glowing digits on my phone burned into my retinas as I sat upright in bed, heart hammering against my ribcage. The sound had pulled me from sleep like a fishhook. That particular inflection, that specific nickname she'd given me when I was 6 years old. A name that existed only in the small radius of our family, never written down, never shared with anyone in this Delaware college town where I'd moved 3 months ago to start over. The townhouse stood silent around me. 3 stories of narrow rooms stacked like compartments in a filing cabinet. I'd chosen the top floor for the bedroom specifically because it felt safer, more removed. Now that distance seemed like a miscalculation. The darkness pressed against the windows, and somewhere below, in the geometric throat of the stairwell, something waited. I grabbed my phone and thumbed the camera to record. The screen's pale glow turned my hands skeletal as I eased the bedroom door open. The hallway stretched before me, empty and ordinary, but the air felt different, denser somehow, as though the oxygen had been replaced with something heavier. My bare feet found the carpet, and I moved toward the stairs with the phone extended like a talisman. The stairwell formed a tight spiral, each floor connected by 13 steps wrapped around a central column. The railing curved down into shadow, and I could smell something faintly chemical, like ozone after a lightning strike. I descended 1 step at a time, the carpet rough beneath my soles, my pulse keeping time with each footfall. Then I heard it again. The voice rose from the landing below, intimate and clear, speaking that name with the exact cadence my mother used when calling me down for dinner 20 years ago. My throat constricted. The phone trembled in my grip, its lens aimed at nothing but empty stairs and the smooth curve of the banister. I forced myself to keep moving, counting the steps, 7, 8, 9, until I reached the second floor landing. The voice had come from right here. I was certain of it, but the landing was empty, just the closed door to the guest room I'd never furnished, and the continuation of the stairwell leading down to the first floor. I swept the phone's camera across every surface, documenting the ordinary wood and plaster, the unremarkable shadows. That's when I saw the powder. A fine coating, almost crystalline, dusted the railing just where my hand would naturally fall. I leaned closer, the phone's screen casting blue light across it. The powder wasn't evenly distributed. It formed a distinct pattern. 4 lines, roughly parallel, each about the width of a finger, as though someone had gripped the railing and left behind this residue when they pulled away. My skin went cold. I'd polished this railing 3 days ago. I was meticulous about it, having developed an obsessive relationship with cleanliness since living alone. This powder was fresh. I touched it with my index finger, expecting it to feel gritty, but it was almost silky, dissolving slightly at the contact. My finger came away clean, though I could swear I felt a faint tingling where the substance had made contact with my skin. I brought my hand closer to my face, trying to catch a scent, but there was nothing. Just that persistent ozone smell hanging in the air. The recording on my phone had captured 12 minutes of nothing. Empty stares, silence, my own ragged breathing. I watched it 3 times before deleting it, embarrassed by my own fear made visible. But I couldn't delete the powder. I went to the kitchen, found a Ziploc bag, and carefully scraped a sample into it with a business card. The residue clung to the plastic, refusing to settle at the bottom like normal powder would. Sleep didn't return that night. I sat on my bed with every light in the townhouse burning, researching the properties of various dusts and powders until my eyes burned. Nothing matched. Around 4 a.m. I remembered my mother mentioning once years ago that her grandmother used to place salt on doorsteps to keep spirits away. The memory felt both foolish and necessary. I bought a box of coarse salt from the bodega 3 blocks over the next morning, ignoring the clerk's curious glance. That evening, I lined the bottom step with a careful barrier, the large crystals catching the overhead light like tiny quartz formations. It felt performative and primitive, but it also felt like action, and action was better than paralysis. For 2 nights, nothing happened. The salt remained undisturbed, and I began to feel the particular shame of someone who'd overreacted to a probably mundane event. I started crafting rational explanations. Maybe a homeless person had found a way in, left that residue, fled before I arrived. Maybe the voice had been a dream so vivid it followed me into waking. Maybe I was more isolated and stressed than I'd admitted to myself. On the 3rd night, at 1:17 a.m. exactly, the knocking began. Not on a door, on the railing itself, near the 2nd floor landing. 3 soft raps, deliberate and measured, like someone testing the solidity of the wood. I lay in bed listening to it, my chest tight, knowing with absolute certainty that I was alone in this building, and that no amount of rationalizing could explain the sound's precision or its timing. I didn't go downstairs. Instead, I pulled the blanket over my head like a child and waited for morning, counting my heartbeats until the darkness thinned to gray. The salt line remained perfect, unbroken. Whatever was making that sound wasn't using the stairs in any conventional way. The knocking became routine after that. Always at 1:17 a.m., always 3 taps on the railing, varying in location but maintaining the same gentle insistence. I tried recording it, but the audio picked up only silence punctuated by my own breathing. I tried staying awake to catch the exact moment it started, but my attention would drift, and suddenly the sound would be there, as though it had always been present and I was only now noticing it. I stopped sleeping properly. The townhouse, which had felt like a sanctuary when I'd signed the lease, began to feel like a narrow cage. The walls seemed closer together, the ceilings pressed down. I caught myself holding my breath while climbing the stairs, as though making noise might attract attention. During the day, I inspected every inch of the stairwell. I found no hidden speakers, no mechanisms that could produce the sounds. The wood was solid throughout, the construction standard. I even called the landlord, fabricating a story about weird settling noises. But he'd only laughed and said old townhouses make all sorts of sounds that I'd get used to it. But these sounds weren't settling. They were intentional. I started documenting everything in a notebook. The exact time of each occurrence, the location of the knocking, any variations in pattern. The act of writing it down made it feel more manageable, more scientific. I was investigating a phenomenon, not cowering from a ghost. This distinction felt important to maintain. Week 3 brought a new development. I woke at 1:17 a.m. not to knocking, but to the sensation of being watched. The bedroom was dark except for the amber glow of the street lamp filtering through the curtains. and in that dim light I could see nothing unusual. But the feeling persisted, a pressure between my shoulder blades, a prickling at the nape of my neck. I turned slowly, scanning the room. My eyes had adjusted enough to make out the familiar shapes. Dresser, chair, closet door slightly ajar. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. But the sensation intensified, and I found myself speaking into the darkness, asking if someone was there, feeling foolish even as the words left my mouth. The knocking answered from the stairwell. 3 taps, then 3 more, then 3 more again. 9 total. A variation in the pattern. I grabbed my phone and descended, no longer bothering with the pretense of recording. The salt line at the bottom step had developed a gap in the center, though I couldn't remember disturbing it. The crystals on either side remained in place, but something had displaced the middle section, scattering the salt in a way that suggested a sweeping motion. The powder had returned to the railing, but this time it covered a larger area. Both sides of the banister showed the finger marks, as though someone had been gripping it while descending. The marks were too high for a child, too deliberate for accident. I followed them down, watching as they appeared on every third step, always on the railing, always in that same 4-finger pattern. They led to the first floor, to the small foyer by the front door. There the marks stopped. The door remained locked. The deadbolt engaged exactly as I'd left it. But on the floor, directly in front of the threshold, more powder had gathered in a shape I couldn't quite interpret. It looked almost like a partial footprint, or the shadow of a footprint, as though someone had stood there and slowly faded away. I spent the rest of that night sitting on my couch, all the lights blazing, trying to convince myself that stress could cause hallucinations, that isolation could warp perception, that the human brain was remarkably skilled at finding patterns in randomness. By morning, I almost believed it. But then I checked my phone and found a photo I didn't remember taking. The timestamp read 1:17 a.m. The image showed the stairwell from above, looking down the spiral. And there, on the second-floor landing, a figure stood with its back to the camera. The image was blurred, as though my hand had been shaking, but I could make out the general shape. Female, average height, one hand resting on the railing. My thumb hovered over the delete button for a full minute before I saved the photo to 3 different backup locations instead. Evidence or madness. I needed to preserve it either way. I called my mother that afternoon, something I'd been avoiding since the move. Our relationship had grown strained over the past year, a slow separation built on disagreements I could barely remember now. Her voice on the phone sounded smaller than I remembered, more fragile. I asked her about the salt, about her grandmother's beliefs, dancing around the real reason for my call. She told me her grandmother had been convinced that certain spirits could become confused, could mistake one place for another, could call out for people who weren't there. The salt was meant to help them remember where they belonged, to show them a boundary they couldn't cross. I asked what happened if the spirit didn't cross the salt but found another way. She was quiet for a long moment before suggesting, very gently, that maybe I should come home for a visit, that living alone in a new city could play tricks on the mind, that stress manifested in unexpected ways. I thanked her and hung up, feeling more isolated than before. That night, I didn't wait for 1:17 a.m. I positioned myself on the stairs at 1 a.m., sitting on the landing between the second and first floors, my back against the wall. If something was going to happen, I wanted to observe it directly, without the mediation of sleep-fogged consciousness or ambiguous audio recordings. The minutes crawled past, and I focused on my breathing, on the solid feel of the wall against my spine, on the ordinary sounds of the townhouse settling around me. A car passed outside, its headlights briefly illuminating the foyer through the frosted window beside the door. The refrigerator hummed from the kitchen. Everything normal, everything explicable. 1:17 a.m. arrived without fanfare. The temperature dropped first. I watched my breath become visible in the stairwell, small clouds forming with each exhalation. The air grew dense again, pressing against my eardrums. And then, directly above me on the second-floor landing, I heard footsteps. Not the knocking, not the voice. Actual footsteps. The soft pad of bare feet on carpet, moving from the guest room toward the railing. I tilted my head back, looking up through the spiral of stairs, and saw nothing. But the footsteps continued, unhurried and distinct, crossing the landing to stand at the exact spot where I'd first found the powder. The railing creaked slightly, the sound of weight being applied. I could hear breathing now, slow and measured. Female. The air around me vibrated with presence, with the undeniable sense that something occupied the space above me, that it was aware of me, that it had been aware of me from the beginning. I wanted to speak, to call out, to demand answers, but my throat had sealed shut, and I could only sit there as the entity, ghost, hallucination, manifestation of stress, stood on the landing above me and breathed. Then it spoke my name, not the nickname this time, but my actual name, in my mother's voice, but with a strange flatness to it, as though the words were being read from a script by someone unfamiliar with their meaning. It said my name 3 times, each repetition slightly different in inflection, as though testing which version sounded most correct. Then the footsteps retreated, moving back toward the guest room, and the door I knew I'd left open clicked softly shut. The temperature normalized, the pressure released. I remained on the stairs for another hour, unable to move, processing what I'd experienced against what I could rationally accept. When I finally climbed back to my bedroom, I found powder on my pillow, arranged in that same 4-finger pattern, as though something had rested its hand there while I was gone. I've lived with it now for 6 weeks. The manifestations continue, evolving in small ways. The knocking has developed a rhythm, almost musical. The powder appears in new locations each morning, on doorknobs, light switches, the bathroom mirror. Twice I've woken to find my furniture slightly rearranged. Nothing dramatic, just small adjustments that suggest someone has been moving through the space, testing how things feel, learning the layout. I've stopped trying to document it. The recordings never show anything useful, and the act of reviewing them only reinforces my uncertainty. Instead, I've developed a kind of détente with whatever shares this townhouse. I no longer use salt. I leave the stairwell lights on at night. I've started speaking softly to the empty air before bed. Nothing elaborate, just a simple acknowledgement that I'm here, that something else might be here too, that we're finding a way to coexist. My mother calls more frequently now. I think she senses something has shifted, though I haven't told her the details. She's mentioned casually that her grandmother used to say some spirits weren't trying to haunt the living, they were just lost, confused about where they belonged, reaching out in the only ways they knew how. Last night at 1:17 a.m., I woke to find a woman standing at the foot of my bed. The room was too dark to see her features clearly, but her outline was distinct, and her hand rested on the footboard exactly where the powder always appears. She stood there for what might have been seconds or minutes. Time felt unstable in that moment, and then she spoke. Not my nickname, not my name. Just a single question, delivered in a voice I almost recognized but couldn't quite place. Am I where I'm supposed to be? I couldn't answer. I didn't know if she was asking me or asking herself. Didn't know if she was real, or if I'd finally broken completely. Didn't know if there was even a difference anymore. She faded before I could decide, dissolving like the powder under my touch, leaving behind only that lingering ozone smell and the certainty that tomorrow night, at 1:17 a.m., something would happen again. I've started wondering if the question was meant for her or for me. Whether I'm the one who's lost, calling out in the dark, leaving traces of myself on railings and mirrors, trying to find my way back to wherever I'm supposed to be. The townhouse feels less like a home and more like a waiting room now, a transitional space where the boundaries between here and elsewhere grow thin. The salt sits unused in my kitchen cabinet. The notebook where I documented everything remains half-filled, abandoned mid-entry. My mother's last voicemail sits unplayed on my phone. Tonight, I'll wait. I'll sit on those stairs at 1:17 a.m. and see what appears. Maybe I'll finally ask my own questions. Maybe I'll finally get answers. Or maybe I'll just sit in the darkness between floors, in that liminal space where the stairs turn and the light doesn't quite reach, and accept that some uncertainties can't be resolved. only endured. The voice will call. The powder will appear. The footsteps will sound on the landing above. And I'll remain here, in this narrow townhouse in Delaware, no longer entirely sure which of us is haunting whom. Story 4. The apartment building smelled different when I returned that afternoon. Not unpleasant exactly, just wrong. Like someone had replaced the usual mixture of coffee and carpet cleaner with something older, something that belonged in my grandmother's linen closet. I stood in the lobby for a moment, keys heavy in my palm, trying to place the scent while my mind still churned through the exam I'd just taken. 3 hours of questions that would determine whether I'd be staying in the city or relocating to the Seattle office, whether the next 6 months would unfold here or somewhere I'd need to rebuild everything from scratch. The elevator groaned upward with its familiar metallic wheeze. 4th floor. The hallway stretched before me, fluorescent lights humming their eternal monotone. My apartment door stood at the end, exactly as I'd left it that morning, the small dent near the peephole catching the light the way it always did. I pushed the key into the lock and felt the tumblers give. Inside, the air carried that same strange perfume. Stronger now, unmistakable. Old-fashioned soap, the kind that came wrapped in thin paper, lavender and something else I couldn't name. The living room looked undisturbed. My coffee mug still sat on the side table where I'd abandoned it. The blinds remained half-drawn, striping the floor with afternoon light. Then I saw them. 3 women stood in the hallway that connected my living room to the bedroom. Not moving, not speaking. Just standing there before the narrow wooden sideboard where I kept old photographs in mismatched frames, and a ceramic bowl that collected loose change and receipts. They seemed to have materialized in the space between heartbeats, as though they'd always been there, and I simply hadn't noticed until now. The one nearest me wore an ivory dress that might have been fashionable decades ago, the fabric thick and textured in a way modern clothes never were. Her hair had been pinned up with unusual care, not a strand out of place. She stood with her hands clasped at her waist, studying the photographs with an expression I couldn't read, somewhere between curiosity and recognition. The second woman had wrapped herself in a wool coat despite the warmth of the apartment. Dark gray with buttons that gleamed dully in the hallway's shadow. She was the one touching the album, her fingers resting on the burgundy leather cover with a gentleness that suggested familiarity. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible, soft as dust settling. Here. Just that one word. The third woman, standing slightly behind the others, had a face like carved stone, all sharp angles and severe lines. Her eyes moved from the photographs to me and back again, assessing, calculating something I couldn't begin to guess. My throat had gone dry. The key slipped from my fingers and hit the floor with a sound that seemed too loud, too sharp. None of them looked at the noise. None of them acknowledged my presence at all. "Excuse me." My voice came out rougher than I intended. "How did you get in here?" No response. The woman in the wool coat lifted the album from the sideboard with both hands, holding it like something precious. She turned slightly, angling it toward the light, and I saw her lips move again, though no sound emerged. The severe one nodded once, a gesture so small I might have imagined it. I took a step forward. The floorboard beneath my foot creaked, the same board that always creaked, the one I'd learned to avoid when coming home late. Still, they didn't react, didn't turn, didn't startle. "That's mine." The words sounded stupid even as I said them. Everything in this apartment was mine. They were standing in my home, touching my things, and I couldn't make sense of how they'd gotten past the lock, past the building's security, past every reasonable barrier between strangers and my private space. The woman in ivory shifted her weight, not toward me, not away, just a subtle redistribution that made the old dress rustle faintly. Up close, I could see the fabric was worn in places, the hem slightly frayed. Her shoes were wrong too, brown leather with thick heels that belonged to another era entirely. The album in the wool-coated woman's hands fell open. I watched the pages flip as though moved by a breeze, though no windows were open, no air stirred. The photographs inside were ones I'd nearly forgotten, Images from years ago, from different apartments and different versions of myself. There was one of me standing outside my first office building, looking young and uncertain and trying not to show it. Another at some forgettable party, red cup in hand, surrounded by faces I could no longer name. The severe woman leaned in, peering at something between the pages. Her finger extended, pointing at a spot I couldn't see. The one in the coat nodded again and carefully, deliberately, turned the album to show me. A piece of paper had been pressed between the pages, folded into a small square. The edges had yellowed. I recognized my own handwriting on the visible portion. Rushed, slanted letters I'd written in a moment I could no longer recall. "What is that?" I heard myself ask, though part of me already knew, already remembered the night I'd written it, and hidden it away because acknowledging it directly seemed like admitting defeat. The woman in the coat extended the album toward me. Not aggressively, not with any particular emotion at all. She simply held it out, waiting, while the scent of that old soap grew stronger until I could taste it at the back of my throat. I took the album. My hands were shaking slightly, from adrenaline, from confusion, from the surreal impossibility of three strangers standing in my home, as though they had every right to be there. The paper felt brittle when I unfolded it, and I had to be careful not to tear the creases. My own words stared back at me. "When things get tight, don't lose your head. Remember, you've been here before. You got through it then. The pressure makes you think you're breaking, but you're just bending. 4 deep breaths. Count them. Then keep moving." I'd written this during a particularly brutal stretch at my previous job, when sleep deprivation and constant deadlines had started making the walls feel closer, making every email seem like an accusation. I'd tucked it into this album as a reminder, then apparently forgotten it existed until 3 strangers excavated it from my own past. When I looked up, they were gone. Not walking away, not moving toward the door, just gone, as though they'd been switched off, their presence erased from the physical world without transition or sound. The hallway stood empty. The sideboard remained exactly as it had been, minus the album now in my hands. The photographs smiled from their frames, frozen moments that meant nothing and everything. The perfume lingered, stronger now, almost cloying. I turned in a slow circle, searching for any sign they'd been real. A displaced rug, a disturbed picture frame, anything to confirm I hadn't imagined the entire encounter. The living room offered nothing. The kitchen, visible through the open doorway, sat pristine and undisturbed. I walked to the front door and checked the lock. Still engaged. The deadbolt I'd turned that morning remained in place. The chain I never used hung loose from its mount, untouched. Behind me, the wall clock ticked its steady rhythm. I glanced at it automatically, the way you do when your mind is trying to anchor itself to something concrete and measurable. The time showed 4:47 p.m. My phone, pulled from my pocket with hands that hadn't quite stopped trembling, read 4:43 p.m. 4 minutes. The clock had gained 4 minutes since I'd left that morning, when I'd checked it against my phone to make sure I wouldn't be late for the exam. I stood there, note still clutched in one hand, trying to construct a rational explanation. A neighbor with a key, playing some elaborate prank. A waking dream brought on by exam stress. A hallucination triggered by... what? I hadn't taken anything, hadn't been drinking, hadn't done anything that would explain seeing 3 fully formed human beings who vanished like smoke. The exam. The thoughts surfaced unbidden. 3 hours of questions designed to probe not just knowledge but judgment, decision-making, stress tolerance. What if they were testing more than they'd said? What if someone had been sent to observe how I'd react to an unexpected situation? But that didn't explain the note. Didn't explain my own handwriting, my own words from years ago. No one could have known about that except me. I forced myself to move through the apartment, checking each room methodically. The bedroom, untouched, bed still unmade from that morning. The bathroom, shower dry, towel hanging where I'd left it. The second bedroom I used as an office, laptop closed, papers stacked in their usual chaotic arrangement. Everything normal, everything exactly as it should be. Except the perfume still hung in the air, and the clock still showed the wrong time, and the note in my hand remained impossible to explain away. I sat on the couch, the album open on my lap, and tried to think. The exam had been difficult but not insurmountable. I'd answered the questions, made it through the scenarios they'd presented, walked out feeling reasonably confident. No red flags. No moments where I'd felt myself slipping or losing the thread. When things get tight, don't lose your head. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, reading advice I'd written to my past self about keeping calm under pressure, while my present self sat in an apartment that had just been invaded by 3 impossible women who'd somehow known exactly where to find a note I'd forgotten existed. My phone buzzed. A text from my supervisor, asking how the exam had gone, whether I felt good about it. I stared at the words, trying to formulate a response that wouldn't sound deranged. It went well, thanks. Also, when I got home, there were 3 strange women in my apartment who disappeared without a trace. Do you know anything about that? Instead, I typed, felt solid. Should hear back next week, right? The response came quickly. That's the timeline. Try not to stress about it in the meantime. Good advice. Impossible to follow. I set the phone down and looked around the living room again, searching for details I might have missed. The light coming through the blinds had shifted slightly, lengthening the shadows. The building's ambient sounds filtered through the walls. Footsteps from the apartment above, the distant murmur of a television, the hydraulic sigh of someone's dishwasher cycling through its routine. All familiar, all normal, all exactly as it should be on an ordinary afternoon in an ordinary building where ordinary things happened. Except, I got up and walked back to the sideboard. The photographs sat in their frames, unchanged. The ceramic bowl held its collection of odds and ends. But there, on the wooden surface, I could see the faint outline where the album had rested before the woman in the coat picked it up. A thin rectangle of dust, lighter than the wood around it, marking the space where something had been, and then wasn't. I placed the album back in that rectangle, perfect fit, as though it had been meant to return there all along. The clock ticked, still 4 minutes fast. I reached up to adjust it, then hesitated. Some instinct I couldn't name made me pull my hand back. Leave it, that instinct whispered. Leave it exactly as it is. Instead, I went to the window and looked down at the street below. Saturday afternoon traffic moved in its lazy weekend pattern. A couple walked past pushing a stroller. Someone parallel parked badly and gave up, pulling away to try the next block. Normal. Mundane. The world continuing exactly as it always had. I turned back to the apartment. The perfume had faded slightly, but I could still catch it when I breathed deeply. That ghost of old soap and something else. Something I still couldn't identify. Memory. Time. The scent of moments that had passed and left only traces behind. The note lay on the coffee table where I'd set it. My handwriting. My words. My advice to a version of myself who'd needed it. Delivered by 3 women who couldn't exist. Who'd found the one hidden thing in this entire apartment that had meaning beyond the surface. Remember, you've been here before. But I hadn't. Not like this. Nothing in my past had prepared me for the particular flavor of wrongness that had seeped into the afternoon, turning the familiar into something strange and uncertain. I picked up my phone again and pulled up my photos, scrolling back through the months. There, the day I'd moved in. Pictures of the empty apartment before I'd filled it with furniture and clutter and the accumulated debris of daily living. The sideboard visible in the background, bare except for a single box sitting on top. I zoomed in on that box. Burgundy leather, the album. I'd moved it here from my previous place, set it down, and apparently never looked at it again until today. Until 3 strangers had opened it and shown me what I'd hidden inside. My hands felt cold despite the apartment's warmth. I rubbed them together, trying to generate friction, heat, some kind of physical sensation to anchor myself. The motion made me think of the woman in the wool coat, how she'd held the album with such careful deliberation, as though it mattered deeply that she handle it correctly. Who were they? The questions circled endlessly. Why had they come? How had they known? And why, when I tried to picture their faces now, Did the details slip away like water through cupped hands? I could remember the ivory dress, the wool coat, the severe expression, but the faces themselves had become vague, indistinct, as though my memory was already editing them out, replacing them with empty spaces wearing clothes. I walked to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. The mirror showed me looking exactly as I'd looked that morning, maybe a bit more tired, the stress of the exam etched in the tightness around my eyes, but recognizable, solid, present. The reflection behind me showed the empty bathroom. No figures lurking in the shower. No faces peering around the doorframe. Just tile and chrome, and the ordinary architecture of a space I knew intimately. I dried my face and went back to the living room. The album still sat on the sideboard. The note still lay on the coffee table. The clock still insisted it was 4 minutes ahead of reality. My phone showed 5:12 p.m. now. The clock read 5:16 p.m. 4 minutes. Exactly 4 minutes. Not drifting further ahead, not correcting itself. Just maintaining that precise gap, as though something had shifted the timeline slightly and left everything else to catch up. I sat back down on the couch and picked up the note again, reading the words I'd written in what felt like another life. The advice seemed both profound and useless. Of course, I shouldn't lose my head. But knowing that and achieving it were entirely different things, especially when the things getting tight included unexplained visitors and temporal anomalies, and the creeping suspicion that something fundamental had shifted without permission. You've been here before. Had I? Was that true? I tried to remember other moments when reality had seemed to slip sideways, when the ordinary had revealed itself to be negotiable. Nothing surfaced. My life had been aggressively normal. School, work, relationships that followed predictable patterns, disappointments that hurt but made sense, achievements that felt earned. No ghosts, no visions, no women materializing in hallways to deliver cryptic messages from my own past. Until today. The light outside continued to fade. I should get up, close the blinds, turn on lamps, begin the evening routine that would carry me through to sleep. Instead, I sat there, note in hand, watching shadows creep across the floor, and wondering whether I'd actually left the apartment that morning, or whether everything since then had been some elaborate construction of a mind finally giving way under pressure I hadn't realized I was carrying. The exam could have broken something. 3 hours of sustained mental effort, stakes higher than I'd wanted to admit. Maybe I'd walked out of that room not to my apartment but to some adjacent version of it, where the rules were slightly different and women could appear and disappear, and clocks could steal minutes without consequence. Or maybe I was exactly where I'd always been, and the women had been exactly what they'd appeared to be, and the only question that mattered was why they'd chosen to show me a reminder I'd written for myself years ago, on this particular day, after this particular test. Don't lose your head. The clock ticked. The building settled around me with its familiar creaks and sighs. Somewhere above, footsteps crossed a floor I'd never seen. Somewhere below, a door closed with a solid thunk that traveled through the walls. I folded the note carefully and placed it back in the album, back between the same pages where it had waited all this time. Then I set the album on the sideboard, in that perfect rectangle of space, and stepped back. The perfume had faded almost completely now. Just a ghost of it remained, barely perceptible. I wondered if I'd imagined it too, if my mind had supplied the scent to make the hallucination more complete, more convincing. But the clock still showed 5:19 p.m. while my phone insisted it was only 5:15 p.m., and that didn't feel like something my imagination would invent. Too specific, too consistent, too much like a signature, a mark left behind to prove that something had happened, even if I could never prove what. I thought about the exam again, about the questions they'd asked, about the scenarios they'd constructed to test my judgment. One had involved a crisis at a remote site, communication breaking down, having to make decisions with incomplete information. Another had explored how I'd handle a colleague showing signs of instability, whether I'd intervene or report or simply watch and wait. Had I passed? Failed? Or had the test continued past that room, extending into my apartment, into this moment? measuring how I responded when faced with an impossible situation, wearing a completely mundane face. I pulled out my phone and typed a message to the building manager, asking if anyone had reported unauthorized access, or whether there had been any maintenance people in the building that afternoon. Then I deleted it without sending. What would I say if she asked why I wanted to know? That 3 women had materialized in my home and vanished again? That they'd touched my things and spoken a single word and left me with questions that had no rational answers? She'd think I was losing it. Maybe she'd be right. The shadows had reached the far wall now, pooling in the corners where the light couldn't penetrate. I got up and turned on a lamp, driving them back, reclaiming the space. The warm glow made everything look safer, more familiar. Just an apartment. Just a collection of rooms containing a collection of objects belonging to a person who'd had a very strange afternoon. I made dinner mechanically. Pasta, jarred sauce, nothing that required much attention. While water boiled, I stood at the kitchen window and watched the building across the street light up window by window as people came home from their Saturdays, from their errands and outings and ordinary activities. Did any of them ever stand in their kitchens wondering if they'd hallucinated their entire afternoon? Or was that a special kind of madness reserved specifically for me? The pasta tasted like nothing. I ate it anyway, fueling the body even as the mind continued to circle the same impossible questions. When I was done, I washed the dishes and put them away and wiped down the counter, following the routine because routine was the only thing that made sense right now. Then I went back to the sideboard. The album sat there, closed, innocent. I picked it up and carried it to the couch, turning on another lamp so I could see clearly. Page by page, I went through it. Every photograph, every moment I'd bothered to preserve. Looking for what, I couldn't say. Clues, maybe. Patterns. Some explanation hidden in the images themselves for why 3 women would choose this particular object to examine, this particular note to reveal. I found nothing. Just my life, documented in fragments. Just proof that I'd existed before today, that there had been a continuous chain of moments leading to this one. When I reached the page where the note had been hidden, I paused. The rectangular impression remained where the paper had pressed against the page below, a subtle indentation that would fade with time. I touched it gently, tracing the outline, and felt something shift in my chest. Not fear exactly, something closer to recognition, like encountering a word you've forgotten the meaning of but still sense the shape of, hovering just beyond conscious recall. The clock read 8:43 p.m. My phone showed 8:39 p.m. Still 4 minutes, still that precise, consistent gap. I closed the album and sat back, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow I would wake up and either remember this as the afternoon I'd finally cracked under pressure, or as the afternoon something genuinely impossible had occurred. Either way, I'd have to keep going. Keep waiting for the exam results. Keep living in this apartment where the walls had proven themselves permeable, and time had proven itself negotiable. 4 deep breaths. Count them. Then keep moving. I counted. 1, 2, 3, 4. The air moved in and out of my lungs exactly as it always had. My heart beat its familiar rhythm. The building settled and creaked and maintained its patient vigil over all of us living our small lives within its walls. And somewhere, maybe, 3 women who shouldn't exist were standing before someone else's sideboard, touching someone else's forgotten things, delivering someone else's message from the past. Or maybe they were gone completely, dissolved back into whatever space holds things that can't be explained. I got up and checked the front door one more time. Locked. Chain in place. Deadbolt engaged. The clock ticked steadily, 4 minutes ahead of everywhere else. I left it that way. Story 5. The lake had no business being that still. I noticed it the moment we pulled up to my brother-in-law's place, the way the water sat flat as hammered steel beneath the October sky. No wind, no ripples, just that perfect glassy surface reflecting the pines and the weathered deck that jutted out over the shoreline like a diving board into oblivion. The house itself seemed to lean toward the water, as if the lake had been slowly pulling at its foundations for decades, patient as erosion. My partner squeezed my hand as we stepped out of the car, her palm damp despite the cold. We'd driven 4 hours from the cities, winding through forests that grew denser and darker the farther north we went, until civilization felt like something we'd imagined. Her brother had bought this place 6 months ago, a steal he'd called it, and now I understood why. The neighboring cabins sat vacant, their windows dark and watching. The whole shoreline had that abandoned feel, like people had decided collectively that this particular stretch of water wasn't worth the view. The air tasted wrong, mineral heavy, with an undertone I couldn't place, like rust and something older. We spent the afternoon unpacking and settling in, trying to ignore the weight of the silence. The house creaked constantly, adjusting to our presence with groans and sighs that seemed almost resentful. Every footstep on the worn floorboards echoed too long. The walls were thin enough that I could hear the lake lapping at the pylons beneath the deck, a wet, rhythmic sound that never quite found a pattern. By evening, fog had begun to crawl across the water's surface, thick and low, moving with purpose rather than drifting. It rolled toward the shore like something living, tendrils reaching for the deck posts. My partner stood at the sliding glass door, watching it come, her breath fogging the glass from the inside. She mentioned that her brother had warned her about the cold. The heating system was old, he'd said, and temperamental. I found the thermostat in the hallway and cranked it up, listening to the ancient furnace shudder to life somewhere in the basement. The sound was wrong, labored, like lungs struggling for air. The bathroom was at the end of a narrow hallway, separated from the main living area by a door that didn't quite fit its frame. I locked both that door and the bathroom door before stepping into the shower, suddenly aware of how isolated we were, how far from anyone who might hear if something went wrong. The water pressure was weak, barely more than a drizzle, and the pipes sang with a high, keening sound that set my teeth on edge. Steam filled the small space quickly, obscuring the mirror, the walls, everything beyond arm's reach. That's when I heard it. 3 distinct knocks on the bathroom door. Deliberate, evenly spaced. I shut off the water, heart hammering, and called out to ask if she needed something. Silence. The kind that feels deliberate, withheld. Then the doorknob turned. Not rattled, not shaken, but turned smoothly, as though a hand had gripped it from the outside and tested the lock with perfect calm. The lock held. The knob returned to its original position with a soft click that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. I stood there dripping, staring at that brass knob, watching for any further movement. Nothing. When I finally opened the door, the hallway was empty. The door to the main room stood open, and through it I could see my partner on the couch, her back to me, reading a book. I asked if she'd knocked. She turned, confusion clear on her face, and told me she'd been sitting there for the past 20 minutes, hadn't moved at all. The heating vents had begun to tick and whisper, expanding metal creating sounds that almost formed words. Almost, but not quite. I dried off and dressed quickly, suddenly desperate for company, for her presence, for anything that felt solid and real. We made dinner together, a simple pasta that neither of us ate much of. The fog outside had thickened into something impenetrable, pressing against the windows like it wanted in. The world beyond the glass had ceased to exist. We could have been floating in void, untethered from everything familiar. After dinner, we retreated to the deck despite the cold, needing air that wasn't trapped inside those thin walls. My partner wrapped herself in a blanket and settled into one of the weathered Adirondack chairs, and I took the one beside her, close enough that our shoulders touched. The fog swirled around us but never quite obscured the deck itself, as if maintaining some invisible boundary. The lake beyond was invisible, present only as sound, that endless patient lapping. That's when I heard her voice behind me, coming from inside the house, calling my name. Not loud, not frantic, just a casual summons, the kind of tone she might use to ask me to grab something from the kitchen. I turned to look at her, sitting perfectly still beside me, her eyes fixed on the fog. She hadn't moved, her lips hadn't moved. Her breath came in visible puffs of white, steady and even, the rhythm unchanged. But the voice came again, clearer this time, definitely from inside, definitely her voice in every particular. The blood drained from my face. I watched her profile, waiting for some acknowledgement, some sign she'd heard it too. Nothing. She sat motionless, staring into the white void, and when I whispered her name, she turned to me slowly. Too slowly. Her expression blank for just a beat too long before recognition flickered in her eyes. She asked what was wrong, told me I looked like I'd seen a ghost. The phrase hung in the air between us, and I couldn't bring myself to tell her what I'd heard. Instead, I suggested we go inside, claiming the cold was getting to me. She agreed readily, too readily, and I wondered if she'd heard something too, if we were both pretending for each other's sake. Inside, the house felt different, smaller. The walls seemed to have moved closer while we were outside, the ceiling lower. Shadows gathered in corners that shouldn't have had shadows given the lamp placement. I checked all the locks on the doors and windows, suddenly paranoid, while she prepared for bed. Everything was secure. We were alone. We had to be alone. That night, I lay awake listening to the house breathe. Because that's what it was doing. I was certain of it now. A slow, steady rhythm of expansion and contraction, the wood and walls moving in time with something I couldn't identify. My partner slept beside me, or appeared to sleep, her breathing shallow and too regular, like she was performing sleep rather than experiencing it. At some point I must have drifted off because I woke to find her standing at the bedroom window, silhouetted against the faint pre-dawn light. The fog had thinned enough to see the lake again, and she stood absolutely still, watching the water. I called her name softly, not wanting to startle her. She didn't respond. I tried again, louder. Nothing. When I got up and touched her shoulder, she turned to face me, and for just an instant, less than a second, I saw something wrong in her eyes. A distance, an absence. Then she blinked and smiled and asked why I was up so early, and the moment passed, leaving me questioning whether I'd seen anything at all. She told me she wanted to walk the shoreline, said the fog was lifting and the morning looked beautiful. I didn't think the morning looked beautiful at all. The light was gray and thin, the kind that makes everything look washed out and distant. But I agreed, unable to articulate my reluctance, unable to give voice to the dread that had settled in my chest like cold water. We walked along the narrow strip of rocky beach, our footsteps crunching too loud in the stillness. The neighboring properties remained dark, empty as graves. The fog clung to the water's surface, refusing to fully lift, creating the illusion that the lake had no far shore, that it simply extended forever into white nothingness. That's when we found the first object. It sat on a flat rock at the waterline, placed with obvious intention. A St. Christopher medal, old and tarnished, the chain broken. Neither of us owned anything like it. Neither did her brother. My partner picked it up, turned it over in her palm, and the look on her face told me she was feeling what I was feeling. This hadn't been here yesterday. We'd have seen it. Farther down the shore we found more. A key that fit no lock in the house. A woman's ring, too small for my partner's fingers, the band corroded green. A pocket watch that had stopped at 3:47, though whether AM or PM, we couldn't know. Each item sat deliberately placed, arranged almost ceremonially, like offerings or warnings. She recalled what her brother had mentioned about the previous owner, an old man who'd lived here for 40 years, who'd given spiritual cleansings according to the neighbors, though they'd been vague about what exactly that meant. He'd sold the place and left abruptly, moved south, wouldn't say why. The neighbors had shared this information with obvious discomfort, like they were breaking some unspoken agreement by talking about it at all. What they had said was that the lake did this sometimes, returned things. Objects would appear on foggy mornings, things no one claimed, things that seemed to come from the water itself. Mostly small items, personal effects, the kinds of things people lose or discard or drop accidentally. But sometimes older things, things that looked like they'd been underwater for decades, impossibly preserved or strangely deteriorated. We gathered the objects without discussing why, carrying them back to the house in our pockets like contraband. The fog was thickening again despite the advancing morning, rolling back in from wherever it had retreated, and I felt an overwhelming urge to be inside, behind locked doors, even though I knew locks meant nothing against whatever was happening here. The rest of the day passed in a haze of normalcy that felt performative. We read, we talked, we pretended everything was fine, but the house kept doing its little things. Doors that had been open standing closed. The shower turning on by itself in the empty bathroom, running for exactly 3 minutes before shutting off. Footsteps on the deck when neither of us was outside. Sounds that might have been the house settling or might have been something moving in the walls. The objects we'd collected sat on the kitchen counter, arranged in a line. I caught my partner staring at them multiple times, her expression distant, and when I asked what she was thinking, she said nothing, but her eyes said something else entirely. That evening, as darkness fell, and the fog became indistinguishable from the night itself, she suggested we try to reach her brother, ask him about the previous owner, about what exactly he'd been told when he bought the place. But our phones had no signal. They'd had signal when we arrived, I was certain of it, but now the bars showed empty, and when I tried the landline, the one her brother swore still worked, I got only static. Not dead air, but static, with something underneath it. Whispers, maybe, or breathing. We were truly isolated now, cut off, and I could see in her face that she knew it too, that this was by design, that we were exactly where something wanted us to be. Night pressed against the windows with physical weight. I checked the locks again, knowing it was futile, knowing that whatever was here had already demonstrated its ability to bypass such things. The bathroom doorknob that had turned from outside when both doors were locked. The shower that ran with no one touching the controls. The voice that had called from an empty kitchen. We sat together on the couch, closer than necessary, and neither of us suggested going to bed. Sleep felt dangerous now, like surrender. The fog outside had become total, erasing even the deck from view. We existed in a bubble of lamplight surrounded by absolute white, and I had the growing conviction that if we stepped outside now, we'd find nothing beyond the door. No lake, no forest, no world at all. Just fog extending infinitely in all directions. The heating system cycled on and off with increasing irregularity, and each time it activated, the house groaned like something in pain. My partner gripped my hand, her fingers ice cold despite the warmth, and I realized she was shaking. Not from cold, from fear. At some point past midnight, we heard it. Movement beneath the deck. Not an animal. Nothing that simple. Footsteps. Slow, methodical, walking the length of the deck from one end to the other, then back again. Over and over. Patient. Persistent. The wood creaked under weight that should have sent whatever it was plunging through the old boards. But the steps continued, never breaking through, never stopping. I wanted to look, wanted to confirm what was making that sound, but couldn't bring myself to approach the windows. My partner's hand tightened on mine, and when I glanced at her face, I saw her lips moving silently, forming words I couldn't hear. Praying, maybe, or pleading. The footsteps stopped directly below us, right beneath where we sat, and in the silence that followed, I heard breathing, deep and wet and wrong, coming from beneath the floor. Then my partner's voice, calling my name from the bedroom. But she sat beside me, her hand in mine, her eyes wide with terror that matched my own. The voice called again, patient and insistent, using inflections I recognized, patterns of speech I knew intimately. It called me like she would call me in the morning, affectionate and familiar. And beneath us, the breathing continued, steady and thick. I looked at the woman beside me, at the hand gripping mine, and felt the question forming, the terrible, necessary question. How long had she been sitting there? When had she sat down? Had I actually seen her sit down, or had I simply looked over and found her there, assumed her presence, accepted without verification? Her eyes met mine, and in them I saw the same question reflected back. When had I returned from checking the locks? Could she be certain it was me who'd come back? Me sitting beside her now? The fog pressed closer, The breathing beneath the floor grew louder. The voice from the bedroom called again, and this time my partner's lips moved in sync with the words, though no sound came from her throat. Or was sound coming, and I simply couldn't hear it over the blood rushing in my ears. The objects on the kitchen counter began to move, sliding across the surface with slow deliberation, arranging themselves into a pattern I almost recognized. The metal, the key, the ring, the watch. Items the lake had returned. Items that had belonged to someone once. Items that were supposed to stay lost. Outside, I heard splashing. Multiple somethings emerging from the water, climbing onto the shore, dragging themselves toward the house with wet, scraping sounds. The fog swirled with their movement, creating shapes that might have been human or might have been nothing at all. My partner stood, or the thing beside me stood, and walked to the window. She pressed her palm against the glass, and on the other side, another hand appeared, matching hers exactly, print for print, line for line. The fog parted just enough to show a face, her face, staring back with eyes that held depths no living thing should possess. She turned to me, the one inside, and smiled. The one outside smiled too, a perfect mirror, and I realized I could no longer remember which was which when the switch had happened, if there had ever been a switch at all. The breathing beneath the floor had become my breathing. The footsteps on the deck matched my heartbeat. The voice from the bedroom called my name in my own voice now, and I understood with crystalline clarity that the lake doesn't just return what it takes. Sometimes it keeps what it returns. The fog rolled through the walls like they weren't there, filling the room, filling my lungs, cold and wet and tasting of minerals and rust and something far older. My partner, both of them, all of them, watched me with identical expressions as I felt myself dissolving, becoming indistinct, becoming one more object the lake would place carefully on the shore for the next visitors to find. The last thing I remembered with certainty was the sound of the shower turning on in the empty bathroom, running at the pressure it should have had all along. 3 knocks on a door, a voice calling from a place it shouldn't be, and the knowledge that when morning came, if morning came, something wearing my face would be sitting on that couch, holding someone's hand, waiting for the fog to lift. But the fog never really lifts. It just learns to look like daylight. Story 6. The locked study at my grandmother's country house had been off limits for as long as I could remember, and in all those years, no one had bothered to explain why. It simply existed as an accepted truth, like the way certain rooms grow cold for no reason, or how some doors refuse to stay closed at night. I'd stopped questioning it by the time I turned 12, the same way you stop questioning why adults whisper when they think you're not listening. But that summer, the summer I turned 32 and found myself unemployed, recently divorced, and desperate enough to accept my grandmother's offer of free room and board, the study began to make itself known in ways that couldn't be ignored. The house sat 3 miles outside of Millbrook, surrounded by fields that had gone fallow decades ago. My grandmother, Opal, still lived there alone, despite my mother's protests. The woman was 87 and sharp as cut glass, with a memory that could recall the exact date of a rainstorm from 1956, but conveniently failed when it came to taking her medication. She'd greeted me at the door with her usual efficiency, showed me to my old room upstairs, and informed me that dinner was at 6 sharp. Then she'd paused, her hand on the doorframe, and added almost as an afterthought that the study remained locked, and I shouldn't concern myself with it. I hadn't asked about it, hadn't even thought about it in years, but her unprompted warning settled into my mind like a splinter. The first week passed uneventfully. I spent my days updating my resume, sending applications into the void, and trying not to think about how my ex-wife was probably already seeing someone new. The house maintained its familiar rhythms, the creak of the third step, the rattling radiators, the way the wind made the window frames hum. I fell into a routine of morning coffee on the porch, afternoons in the library with my laptop, and evenings watching Opal work through her crossword puzzles with methodical precision. It was on the 8th night that I first heard it. I'd gone downstairs for water, padding through the dark hallway in my bare feet. The floorboards were cool against my soles, almost damp, though the evening had been dry. As I passed the study door, solid oak, with a brass padlock that looked older than I was, I heard it, the distinct scratch of something moving across paper, not the rustle of pages turning, but the deliberate rhythmic sound of writing. A nib dragging across fiber, leaving ink in its wake. I stopped, my hand frozen on the banister. The sound continued for 3 more strokes, then paused. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own heartbeat, a dull thunder in my ears. Then it resumed, scratch, pause, scratch, scratch, pause, with the irregularity of someone choosing their words carefully. The rational part of my brain cycled through explanations. Mice in the walls, tree branches against the window, the house settling. But the sound was too deliberate, too clearly the product of intention rather than chance. I pressed my ear against the door, feeling the wood cool against my cheek. The scratching continued, joined now by a sound I couldn't quite place. A soft exhalation, the kind someone makes when they're concentrating deeply on a task. I stood there for what might have been 5 minutes or 20, until the sound finally stopped and my feet began to ache from standing still. When I finally went back upstairs, I didn't get the water. I didn't sleep much either. The next morning, I asked Opal about it over breakfast. She was precise in her movements as always, spreading exactly 1 tablespoon of marmalade on her toast, her weathered hands steady. She mentioned there might be mice, her tone suggesting the conversation was already over. Then she asked if I'd heard back from any of the companies I'd applied to, and I understood that the subject was closed. But the sounds continued. Every evening around 6, just as the sun began its descent and the light turned golden and heavy, I would hear them. The scratch of pen on paper, sometimes accompanied by that peculiar breathing, sometimes by a smell that would creep into the hallway. Sweet tobacco, the kind that probably hadn't been sold in decades, rich and cloying. It would linger for minutes, then dissipate like it had never been there at all. I started timing my movements through the house to avoid passing the study door at dusk. I'd take the long way from my room to the kitchen, going through the conservatory instead of the main hallway. But somehow, I'd find myself standing outside that door anyway, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. The sounds would be there, waiting, scratch, scratch, pause, the soft sigh of concentration. And once distinctly, the creak of a chair shifting weight. 3 weeks into my stay, I worked up the courage to knock. I don't know what possessed me to do it. Maybe it was the isolation finally getting to me. The endless rejection emails. The creeping sense that my life had become a room I couldn't find my way out of. Maybe I just needed to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind, that there was a rational explanation for sounds coming from a locked room. I raised my fist and rapped 3 times on the oak, each knock echoing down the hallway like a gunshot. The scratching stopped immediately. Not gradually, not with the natural pause of someone interrupted, but cut off with surgical precision. In its place came breathing, short, sharp, the respiration of someone caught off guard. I could feel my own breath matching it, my chest tight with a fear I couldn't articulate. Someone was in there, something was in there, and now it knew I was listening. I backed away from the door, my legs moving of their own accord. The breathing continued, steady and measured, and I had the sudden, overwhelming certainty that whoever, whatever was inside was pressed against the door just as I had been, separated from me by nothing but 2 inches of oak and a brass padlock. I practically ran back to my room. That night I dreamed of the study. In the dream, I could see through the door as if it were glass. The room was exactly as I remembered it from the single time I'd seen inside as a child. A large mahogany desk positioned beneath the window, bookshelves lining the walls, a worn leather chair. But sitting at the desk was a figure I couldn't quite focus on. Every time I tried to look directly at it, my eyes would slide away, like trying to stare at the sun. All I could make out was the movement of a hand, left-handed, moving across paper in steady, deliberate strokes, and the conviction, absolute and terrifying, that if the figure turned around, I would see my own face looking back at me. I woke up with my heart pounding, my sheets soaked with sweat. The next morning, I confronted Opal. I told her I'd heard the sounds, smelled the tobacco, knocked on the door. She listened without interrupting, her face betraying nothing. When I finished, she set down her coffee cup with deliberate care and informed me she'd show me what was in the study if I was so determined to know. My grandmother had never been one for drama. She retrieved the key from wherever she kept it. I noticed her hands didn't shake at all and led me to the door. The padlock opened with a click that seemed too loud in the quiet hallway. The door swung inward, hinges silent. The room was empty. Not empty in the sense of being unoccupied, but truly empty. No furniture except for the desk beneath the window. No books on the shelves. No papers. No lamp. Nothing to suggest the room had been used recently or ever. The desk itself was scarred with circular marks, overlapping rings like the inside of a tree trunk, as if someone had set down a hot mug hundreds of times in slightly different positions. And there, positioned to the right of these marks, lay a quill pen, its feather dried and brittle, its nib darkened with what might have been ancient ink, positioned for a left-handed writer. Opal mentioned the room had been her late husband's study decades ago. He'd been left-handed. He'd smoked a pipe. He'd spent every evening before dinner here, writing correspondence that she'd never asked about. The room had been locked since his passing, some 40 years prior, and she preferred to keep it that way. Then she asked if I was satisfied, her tone making it clear what the correct answer should be. I nodded. She locked the door again, and we returned to our breakfast as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. I couldn't articulate what it was, only that the house felt different now, like a picture that's been hung slightly off-center. The sounds from the study continued. If anything, they grew more frequent, starting earlier in the afternoon and lasting longer into the night. But now I could hear other things too. Footsteps in the hallway when I was alone upstairs. The creak of a chair from the library when no one was sitting there. And everywhere, persistent and invasive, that smell of sweet tobacco. I started finding things out of place. My laptop would be closed when I was certain I'd left it open. Papers would be reordered. My coffee mug, I always set it to the right of my laptop, being right-handed, would migrate to the left. Small things, easily explained away by forgetfulness, by stress, by the general disorder of a life coming apart at the seams. Except I wasn't forgetting. I was certain of where I'd placed things, absolutely certain, and they were moving. One evening, I found myself standing outside the study again, my hand raised to knock. I couldn't remember walking there. The last thing I recalled was sitting in the library, reading through job listings. And then I was here, my fist already in motion. I knocked 3 times before I could stop myself. The scratching stopped. The breathing began. But this time, the door was unlocked. I don't know how I knew. I hadn't touched the handle, hadn't seen Opal approach with the key, but I was absolutely certain that if I tried the door, it would open. All I had to do was reach out, turn the handle, step inside and see what was writing in a room that contained nothing but a scarred desk and a dried quill pen. My hand was on the brass knob when Opal's voice cut through the hallway. She asked what I was doing, her tone sharp enough to make me step back. She was standing at the end of the hallway, her face unreadable in the dying light. She mentioned she'd told me the study was locked, as if I'd forgotten, as if the door wasn't unlocked right now, right under my hand, waiting. But when I looked back at the door, the padlock was there, firmly in place, had been there all along. I started avoiding the house during the late afternoon. I'd drive into town, sit in the library there, anywhere to escape the sounds and smells that seemed to follow me room to room. But I'd always return at night, and I'd always end up outside that door, listening to the scratch of pen on paper, smelling tobacco smoke from a pipe that hadn't been lit in 40 years. Last night I woke up at 3 a.m. and found myself standing in the hallway outside the study. I have no memory of leaving my bed. I was barefoot, wearing only my t-shirt and boxers, and my right hand ached like I'd been gripping something tightly for hours. When I looked down, there was ink on my fingers, dark blue, the kind that comes from a fountain pen or a quill. It stained the creases of my knuckles, the whorls of my fingerprints. I scrubbed my hands in the bathroom sink until they were raw, watching the water run blue and then clear. But I can still see the faint stain on my skin, or maybe I just imagine I can. It's hard to tell the difference anymore. This morning, Opal asked me at breakfast if I'd been sleeping well. Her eyes were sharp, focused on me with an intensity I'd never seen before. She mentioned I looked tired, that perhaps the country air wasn't agreeing with me. That maybe it would be better if I found my own place, sooner rather than later. I agreed with her, told her I'd start looking this week. But I haven't. Won't. Can't. Because last night, standing outside that locked door at 3 a.m. with ink on my hands, I heard something that changed everything. The breathing behind the door, the short, sharp gasps of concentration. They were matching my own. Exactly. Perfectly synchronized, and when I pressed my ear against the wood, I heard the scratching of the pen, and I knew, with a certainty that fills me with a terror I can't name, exactly what was being written. These words, this exact account, in a left-handed script, even though I'm right-handed, even though the room is empty, even though my grandfather died before I was born. Tonight, the sun is setting again. The light is turning golden and heavy. I can already smell the tobacco drifting into the hallway, and I'm standing outside the study door with my hand on the knob, knowing that this time, locked or unlocked, empty or occupied, I'm going to open it. I'm going to see who's been writing, and I have a terrible feeling. No, not a feeling, a certainty, that they've been waiting for me to join them all along. Story 7. In the fluorescent lights in the men's restroom buzz with a rhythm I've memorized over 3 years of night shifts. 16 seconds of steady hum, then a flicker that lasts exactly 2 heartbeats. I count them while I work, the mop handle slick with disinfectant, the tile floor reflecting the sickly green glow overhead. The I-80 rest stop at mile marker 237 sees maybe 40 visitors on a good night. Truckers mostly, the occasional family making the long haul from Reno to Salt Lake. During my shift, from midnight to 8, I'm usually alone with the vending machines and the wind that screams across the desert like something dying. It was a Tuesday when I first saw her, or maybe a Wednesday. The days blur together out here, where the only distinction between them is whether the wind comes from the north or the south. I was doing my 2 a.m. bathroom check, the routine I've perfected to the point of meditation. Check the stalls, refill the paper towels, squeegee the mirrors. The neon restroom sign outside throws a pink wash through the frosted window, and it was trembling that night, pulsing with the wind that rattled the building's aluminum siding. I was wiping down the mirror above the sinks when I saw her behind me. She stood next to the water fountain just outside the bathroom doorway, perfectly still in a way that human beings aren't meant to be still. But it was her skin that made my hand freeze mid-wipe, made my breath catch somewhere between my lungs and my throat. It looked like ice that's been frozen and thawed too many times. That dirty, fractured texture you see on puddles in parking lots. Cracks spider-webbed across her face, her neck, her bare arms. The fluorescent light caught in those fissures, making them glow with an oily iridescence. I spun around, the wet squeegee still in my hand, dripping blue cleaning solution onto my boots. The doorway was empty. The water fountain stood alone, its chrome fixture reflecting nothing but the hallway's dim emergency lighting. My heart hammered against my ribs like it was trying to break free. I checked the hallway, looked into the women's restroom across the way, even walked outside into the parking lot where a single 18-wheeler sat idling, its driver presumably asleep in the cab. The desert stretched out in every direction, flat and moonlit and utterly empty. When I came back inside, I avoided looking at the mirrors for the rest of my shift. The rational part of my brain, the part that had gotten me through 2 tours in Afghanistan and a divorce that nearly broke me, said it was fatigue. Said I'd been working too many doubles, that the isolation was getting to me, that the mind plays tricks in the small hours when the world feels like it's holding its breath. I almost convinced myself. Almost. But 3 nights later, during my midnight rounds, I saw her again. This time I wasn't even looking at the mirror directly. I was bending down to pick up a discarded paper cup near the urinals, and I caught her in my peripheral vision. She was closer now, standing just inside the bathroom doorway, her head tilted at an angle that would have broken a living person's neck. The cracks in her skin had spread, deepened. When I looked up at the mirror fully, I could see something dark and wet seeping from the fissures, though it didn't seem to drip. It just clung there, viscous and wrong. I didn't turn around this time. I kept my eyes on the reflection, watching as she took a step forward. The movement was all wrong, stilted, like stop-motion animation, like her joints were frozen and had to shatter through ice with each motion. The sound of it echoed in my head even though the bathroom was silent except for that eternal fluorescent buzz. Then she was gone, blinked out of existence like someone had changed the channel. I left the paper cup on the floor and walked out, my hands shaking so badly I had to stuff them in my pockets. That night, I covered every mirror in the facility with duct tape, told my supervisor the next morning that someone had smashed them with graffiti, that I was waiting for the replacement glass to come in. He barely looked up from his coffee, just grunted something about filing a report. The tape stayed up. The water was next. I was washing my hands in the break room sink, a small, dingy space with a microwave that only works on one setting, and a table covered in years of coffee rings, when I noticed the way the water rippled. It wasn't following the pattern it should, the normal concentric circles of liquid hitting liquid. Instead, it sloshed back and forth in the basin, like something beneath the surface was breathing. I shut off the faucet, and the water went still immediately. Too still, like glass, like ice. When I leaned closer, I could see my face reflected in the pool of water cupped in the porcelain basin. And behind my reflection, in the corner of the room where the mop bucket lives, I saw her standing there. The cracks had spread so far that chunks of her seemed to be missing now, dark gaps in her form that my mind couldn't quite process. When I jerked my head around, the corner was empty. When I looked back at the water, she was leaning over my shoulder, her face close enough that I should have been able to feel her breath. I yanked the drain plug and watched the water spiral away, taking her image with it. After that, I added a new rule to my routine. Turn off all water sources before sunset. Every sink, every toilet, every fountain. I'd go through the entire facility and make sure nothing could create a reflection. The truckers complained about having to use the hand sanitizer dispenser I installed by the door, but I told them the plumbing was having issues. Another lie to add to the growing collection. Some nights when I'm doing my rounds, I hear water running. Impossible, because I've checked every valve, every connection, every pipe. But there it is, the distinct sound of liquid hitting porcelain, echoing from the men's restroom or the janitor's closet, or sometimes from places where there shouldn't be any plumbing at all. When I go to investigate, everything is dry, everything is off, everything is exactly as I left it. Except sometimes there are wet footprints on the floor, small ones, bare feet, the kind that would come from someone who'd been standing in a puddle. They lead from the bathrooms to the vending machines, from the vending machines to the front doors, from the front doors to the dark parking lot where they vanish at the edge of the floodlight's reach. I stopped following them after the first week. The worst part isn't seeing her. It's the waiting. I'll be sitting in my office, a glorified closet with a desk, a monitor showing the parking lot security feed, and a space heater that gave out last winter, and I'll feel it. That prickle on the back of my neck that means I'm being watched. I'll check the monitor. Nothing. Check the hallway. Nothing. But the feeling persists, heavy and cold, like standing next to an open freezer. Sometimes I catch myself listening for her, for the sound of those joints breaking through their icy constraints, for the wet, sticky noise of something seeping from cracks, for footsteps that don't quite fall in human rhythm. The fluorescent lights still flicker every 16 seconds, but now when they do, I brace myself, because in that 2-heartbeat gap of darkness, anything could appear. Anyone could be standing behind me. I bought a flashlight that I keep in my pocket, one of those tactical ones bright enough to light up the whole parking lot. I tell myself it's for security purposes. Really, it's because I'm terrified of the dark in a way I haven't been since childhood. since before I learned that the real monsters wear human faces and carry rifles and hide in buildings made of clay and rebar. This is different. This is worse, because I can't shoot at a reflection, can't call in an airstrike on something that only exists in water and glass and the corner of my vision. Can't even talk about it without sounding like I've lost my grip on reality. Maybe I have. Last week, I broke my own rules. It was 4 in the morning, that dead hour when even the trucks have stopped pulling in, when the whole world feels suspended between night and day. I had to use the bathroom, really use it, not just check it. And I made the mistake of looking at the taped-over mirror while I was washing my hands. The duct tape was wet, not damp, not moist, soaking wet, water running down the wall in rivulets, pooling on the counter. I touched it with one trembling finger and it squelched, releasing a trickle that splashed into the sink below. The water in the sink began to ripple despite the faucet being off. I should have left, should have walked out and driven straight to the supervisor's house and quit on the spot. Instead, I peeled back a corner of the tape. She was there, of course. Not behind me this time, but inside the mirror, pressed against the glass from the other side. Her face was right there, inches from mine, separated only by the silver-backed surface. The cracks had consumed her almost entirely now. She was more gap than substance, more absence than presence. But her eyes, what remained of them in the fractured landscape of her face, were fixed on mine with an intensity that made my bladder want to release. Her mouth moved. The cracks around it widened, pieces of her jaw separating like ice calving from a glacier. I couldn't hear anything, but I could read the shape of the words forming on what was left of her lips. Let me out. I slammed the tape back down and backed away until my spine hit the opposite wall. The wet tape held for a moment, then began to peel at the edges, heavy with water that shouldn't exist. I grabbed the roll from my cart and wound it around the mirror again and again, layering it until the silver was completely obscured, until my hands were sticky with adhesive and my breathing was ragged with panic. The water stopped seeping through, but now, even with my eyes closed, I can see her face, can see the way those cracks spiderweb across her skin like a windshield about to shatter, can see the darkness pooling in the gaps, can see the desperation in those fragmenting eyes. I'm writing this in my office at 3:47 a.m. on a Thursday that might be a Friday. The monitor shows an empty parking lot. The facility is silent except for the wind and the fluorescent buzz and a sound that might be water dripping somewhere despite my precautions. Yesterday, I found a wet handprint on the outside of my office door. Small fingers. A woman's hand. When I touched it, my fingers came away cold and slightly oily. Today, when I turned on the bathroom lights for the evening check, all the duct tape was gone. Just gone. The mirrors were clean and clear and showed nothing but my own haggard face staring back. I haven't looked directly at them since. I've been doing my rounds with my eyes on the floor, checking the rooms by the shadows they cast, navigating by memory and peripheral vision. But I can feel her watching me, from every reflective surface, from every pool of water, from every shadow where the light catches just wrong. The worst part is the doubt. Because sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark with nothing but the wind for company, I wonder if she's real at all. If maybe I'm the one who's fractured. If maybe I'm the one who's breaking into pieces, watching myself disintegrate in every reflection, seeing my own mind crack and seep and fall apart. The fluorescent lights just flickered. In those 2 heartbeats of darkness, I heard footsteps behind me. I'm not going to turn around. I'm not going to look at the monitor. I'm just going to sit here and wait for the sun to rise over the desert, for my shift to end, for Friday or Saturday or whatever day comes next. And I'm going to try very, very hard not to think about the fact that the sun rising means nothing when you work nights. That when my shift ends, I'll drive home in the daylight and see my face in the rearview mirror and wonder whose eyes are looking back. That tonight, at midnight, I'll come back here and do it all again. Because that's the thing about night shifts at rest stops on forgotten stretches of highway. You can quit anytime you want, but something tells me that won't matter anymore. Something tells me she's not in the mirrors. She's not in the water. She's been standing behind me this whole time, and I've been so focused on the reflections that I never thought to look at the darkness where the light doesn't reach. The footsteps are getting closer. The fluorescent lights are about to flicker again. I can feel the cold seeping into my back, and I still don't know if any of this is real. Story 8. The hand on my shoulder felt real, warm pressure through my cotton shirt, firm enough to ground me but gentle enough not to startle. The whisper came close to my ear, intimate as a lover's breath. Slow down. I was already doing 30 in a 45 zone, crawling through the outskirts of some Kansas town, whose name I'd forget by morning. The sky had that bruised quality you only get in the Midwest, purple-black clouds pregnant with rain that hadn't fallen yet. My foot eased off the gas anyway, some animal part of my brain responding to that voice before my rational mind could question why I was taking orders from empty air. The SUV came from my right like a missile. It blew through the red light without even tapping the brakes, and I watched, in that stretched taffy slowness that terror brings, as it clipped an orange construction cone maybe 10 feet ahead of me. The cone spiraled into the air, plastic fragments catching the dying light. If I'd been going my normal speed, if I hadn't slowed those extra few seconds, the SUV would have caught me broadside, driver's door, right where my ribs cage my too fast heart. I sat at that intersection for a long time after, waiting for my hands to stop shaking enough to grip the wheel. The rain finally came, fat drops that exploded against the windshield like accusations. I didn't look over my shoulder. I didn't want to confirm what I already knew, that the passenger seat was empty, had been empty, would always be empty. That was 3 weeks ago. I'd almost convinced myself it was my imagination, some guardian angel instinct firing in my subconscious. The way people say mothers can lift cars off their children. The mind does strange things under stress, and I'd been stressed. New city, new job, new apartment that still smelled like someone else's life despite 3 coats of paint. Then it happened again. I'd fallen asleep on the couch, laptop still warm on my chest. Some documentary about deep-sea creatures playing to an audience of none. I woke to darkness and that voice, the same timbre, the same warmth that shouldn't exist in sound waves traveling through empty rooms. Smell it. Not smell that. Or, do you smell something? Just the command, stark and certain. I was on my feet before conscious thought caught up, stumbling through the narrow hallway of my apartment, following some invisible thread. The scent hit me halfway to the kitchen, faint at first, then stronger. Gas. The raw, rotten egg stink of natural gas, the kind that makes headlines when entire buildings turn into fireballs. The stove's front burner was on, turned to the lowest setting, the kind of position where the automatic ignition doesn't catch. How long had it been hissing poison into my sealed apartment? The LED clock on the microwave said 3:47 a.m. I'd crashed around midnight. Nearly 4 hours of gas seeping into rooms, pooling near the floor, waiting for a spark. My hands shook as I twisted the knob off and threw open every window I could reach. The October air rushed in, cold enough to hurt my teeth, but I gulped it down anyway, trying to flush the gas from my lungs, my apartment, my suddenly too fragile life. That's when I smelled it. Under the gas, behind the sharp bite of autumn air. The sweet, old-fashioned scent of barbershop cologne. Bay rum and vanilla, the kind my grandfather used to wear. The kind you can't buy at regular stores anymore. I stood in my kitchen at 4 in the morning, surrounded by the evidence of my near death, breathing in a ghost's aftershave. I don't wear cologne. I live alone. The apartment had been empty for 3 months before I moved in, according to the landlord. There was no rational explanation, and I was tired of looking for one. The next morning I called in sick, first time at the new job, but I couldn't imagine sitting in meetings, pretending normalcy while my world quietly unraveled. Instead, I went to the library. Not the sleek downtown branch with its glass walls and tablet checkout, but the old Carnegie building on 5th Street, the one that still used card catalogs and smelled like decaying paper and secrets. I didn't know what I was looking for exactly. Evidence? Confirmation? Permission to believe I wasn't losing my mind? The newspapers were stored on microfilm, and I spent hours scrolling through grainy images of the past, my eyes aching in the dim light. I wasn't sure what year to check. Wasn't even sure what I was checking for. I started with my building's address, searching for fires, accidents, anything that might explain a protective presence with a taste for vintage cologne. What I found was worse than nothing. The building had no history. It was only 12 years old, constructed on what used to be a vacant lot. Before that, according to county records, the land had been part of a larger property that burned down in 1958. No deaths in the fire. The family had been out at the time. But there was a follow-up article, just a few column inches on page 7, 3 months later. The father had died in a car accident, broadside collision at an intersection. The other driver had run a red light. My mouth went dry. I kept scrolling. The mother had moved away with their son. No more mentions in the local papers. Dead end, literally and figuratively. I sat back in the uncomfortable wooden chair, listening to the library's ancient heating system clunk and wheeze. Coincidence. It had to be coincidence. Except I didn't believe in coincidences anymore, not since a hand that wasn't there had kept me from becoming a statistic. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed with all the lights on, listening to the building settle around me. Every creak was a footstep. Every shift of air from the heating vents was breath on my neck. The clock ticked toward 3:47 a.m. like it was counting down to something. The voice came at 3:52. Don't go. I was already half out of bed, had been for the last 10 minutes, needing to pee but afraid to leave the relative safety of my room. The voice froze me in place, one foot on the floor, one still tangled in sheets. My bathroom light was on. I could see the yellow glow under the door. I'd left it that way, had left all the lights on, terrified of darkness and what it might contain. The light went out. Not a flicker, not a fade. Just there, then gone, with a soft pop that might have been the bulb or might have been something else. I stood there, caught between the need to empty my bladder and the screaming certainty that something waited in that darkness. Something patient, something hungry. I held it until morning, until sunrise painted my windows gold, and the ordinary world reasserted itself with traffic sounds and neighbors' footsteps overhead. When I finally checked the bathroom, the bulb was fine. It worked perfectly, casting its mundane glow over white tiles and chrome fixtures. No signs of anything wrong, but under the sink, I found the leak. The pipe had corroded through. Old building, cheap materials, landlord who cut corners. Water had been dripping down onto the electrical outlet, the one I'd have stepped into in my bare feet at 4 a.m, still half asleep, standing in a puddle while reaching for the light switch. I moved out that weekend. The new place was supposed to be better. 8th floor of a downtown high-rise, security cameras, doorman, other people's lives humming around me like insulation against the impossible. I bought new furniture, left the old stuff for the next tenant. Fresh start, clean slate, normal life. The voice found me anyway. It started small. Left pocket, when I was about to walk out without my keys. Check again, when I'd missed a decimal point in a work email that would have cost the company thousands. Always protecting, always knowing what I couldn't see, couldn't know, shouldn't survive without help. I should have been grateful. Part of me was, the part that wanted to live, that appreciated the safety net of an unseen guardian. But the larger part, the part that still believed in free will and rational explanations, felt the walls closing in. I started testing it, deliberately putting myself in minor danger, waiting to see if the voice would intervene. I'd let food burn on the stove, step into traffic without looking, leave candles lit when I left the room. Each time, the whisper came, calm, patient, certain. Each time, I was saved from my own manufactured disasters. But there was a pattern I'd started to notice. The voice never spoke unless I was alone. And lately, I'd been arranging to be alone more and more often, turning down invitations, avoiding the office, letting friendships wither on the vine of my increasing isolation. When had that started? Had I chosen it? Or had I been guided toward it by subtle whispers I couldn't quite remember? I started keeping a journal, trying to track the interventions, looking for meaning in the gaps between warnings. The entries grew paranoid, obsessive. Why does it help me? What does it want? Why can I smell cologne that hasn't been manufactured since the 1970s? 3 nights ago, I found an old high school yearbook at an estate sale. I don't know what made me buy it. Vintage 1976, from a school 2 states away that I'd never attended. But something drew me to it. Some invisible thread tugging at my consciousness. I found him on page 47. The cologne-scented phantom had a face now, grainy and black and white, but unmistakable. I'd seen those eyes in my bathroom mirror, inherited through blood and genetics I'd never questioned until now. My grandfather stared out from the past, young and serious in his senior portrait, the caption listing his name and his plans, hoping to serve and protect. He died when my father was 12. Carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty furnace. They'd found him in the morning, still in his chair, the newspaper from the night before still in his lap. Quick, painless, random chance. Except my father had spent that night at a friend's house. A last-minute sleepover, unplanned, unusual for a school night. Had someone told him to go? Had some voice whispered in his ear the way it whispered in mine? The realization hit like ice water. This had been happening for generations. Guardian angels or family curse, protective instinct or parasitic attachment. I didn't know which. And the not knowing ate at me worse than any clear answer could. I went to see my father yesterday. I hadn't visited in months, another relationship casualty of my increasing isolation. He looked older than I remembered, gray threading through his hair, lines deepening around his eyes. We made small talk over coffee, dancing around the real questions I needed to ask. Finally, I broke. I told him everything, the voice, the interventions, the cologne, the yearbook. I watched his face as I spoke, looking for recognition, denial, anything. He set down his mug carefully, the way you'd handle something fragile. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, measured, the way you'd talk to someone standing on a ledge. I stopped listening 20 years ago, he said. The voice doesn't like it when you stop listening. He wouldn't say more. Claimed he had an appointment, showed me to the door with shaking hands, and I stood on his porch watching my own father lock me out of his house, out of whatever truth he'd been living with for decades. I drove home through rush hour traffic, the voice silent in my ear. But I could feel it there, waiting, patient as erosion, watching. And for the first time I wondered, was I being protected, or was I being kept? Tonight I'm writing this with all the lights on, sitting in the middle of my living room where I can see every door, every window, every possible entrance for things that don't need doors to enter. The clock reads 3:43 a.m. The air smells like bay rum and vanilla, thick enough to choke on, and I haven't worn cologne since high school. My phone is in my left pocket. My keys are on the counter where I can see them. The stove is off. Every window is closed. I've checked the smoke detectors, the carbon monoxide alarm, the locks. I've done everything right, been as safe as any human can be in a world full of invisible dangers. But I'm starting to understand that safety isn't the same as freedom. In 4 minutes, it will be 3:47 a.m., the time I almost died from gas leak, the time the voice pulled me from sleep into salvation. I wonder if that's significant. I wonder if time loops in patterns I'm only beginning to recognize. I wonder if my grandfather is protecting me from the world, or protecting something else from my interference in its plans. The air shifts. I feel the familiar weight of a hand on my shoulder, warm, gentle, grounding. The whisper comes, close enough to feel breath that has no source. Don't write the ending. But this time I don't listen. This time I keep typing, fingers moving across keys while that impossible hand tries to still them, while the scent of cologne grows thick enough to taste. Because if I'm being saved from every danger the world can throw at me, kept alive and isolated and increasingly dependent on warnings from the dead, then maybe the real question isn't what's protecting me. Maybe it's, what am I being kept alive for? The pressure on my shoulder intensifies. The room temperature drops 10 degrees in as many seconds. My laptop screen flickers. But I keep typing, keep questioning, keep choosing my own disasters over someone else's salvation. Because sometimes the only way to be free is to stop being safe. The clock strikes 3:47, and the voice screams. Not a whisper anymore, but a roar that shakes the windows, rattles the glasses in my kitchen, sends my coffee mug rolling across the floor. One word, repeated, desperate, furious. Stay. But I'm already reaching for my keys, already moving toward the door, already choosing uncertainty over this suffocating protection. Whatever happens next, car crash, gas explosion, random chance, or calculated destiny, it will be mine. My choice, my ending. I step into the hallway and the scent of cologne follows me like a threat. Or maybe like grief. I still don't know which. I'm not sure I ever will. Story 9. The pocket watch arrived 3 days after my uncle's funeral, wrapped in tissue paper that smelled faintly of tobacco and old books. No note, just the watch itself. Brass casing worn smooth by decades of handling. The crystal face spider-webbed with hairline cracks. The mechanism still worked, ticking with a soft, insistent rhythm that seemed louder than it should have been in my apartment's silence. I'd never been close to my uncle. He'd been a recluse, living alone in that sprawling house upstate. And when the lawyer called about the inheritance, I'd expected nothing more than outdated furniture and unpaid bills. Instead, there was only the watch, specifically bequeathed to me in a handwritten codicil that the estate attorney had seemed uncomfortable reading aloud. The first morning after it arrived, I woke to find my living room transformed. The shirts I'd draped over the armchair the night before, too tired to hang them properly after coming home from work, were gone. I found them in my bedroom dresser, folded with military precision, creased along lines I'd never bothered to create. The sight sent a cold thread of unease through my chest, but I rationalized it away. Sleepwalking, perhaps. Stress from the long hours at the office. I'd been working myself ragged lately, sometimes arriving home so exhausted that entire portions of my evening disappeared into fog. But I didn't remember folding those shirts. The second incident happened that same afternoon. I'd left the kettle on the stove, empty, while I took a shower. The whistle shrieked through the apartment, piercing and urgent, and I'd stumbled out wrapped in a towel, my heart hammering. The kettle sat on the burner, bone dry, the metal bottom starting to discolor from the heat. I turned off the flame with shaking hands, certain, absolutely certain, that I'd filled it with water before stepping into the bathroom. The memory was vivid. Cold tap running, water splashing into the kettle's interior, the weight of it as I'd set it down. But the evidence contradicted everything. The kettle was empty, had been empty the entire time. I started making lists, checking them compulsively. Windows locked, check. Stove off, check. Coffee maker unplugged, check. Every night before bed, I'd walk through the apartment, noting the position of objects with an attention that felt increasingly paranoid. The couch cushions arranged just so. The mail stacked on the counter at a specific angle. My laptop closed and centered on the desk. On the fourth night, I found 2 coffee cups on the sideboard. They hadn't been there when I'd gone to bed. I was sure of that. As sure as I could be about anything anymore. Both were clean, turned upside down on matching saucers, positioned with such deliberate symmetry that they looked staged. I stood in the doorway to my living room, the hallway light casting long shadows across the hardwood floor, and felt my skin prickle with the unmistakable sensation of being watched. The apartment was silent, except for the ticking of the pocket watch, which I'd left on my nightstand. From the bedroom, the sound seemed to pulse through the walls, steady and relentless. I checked the security footage on my phone. I'd installed cameras after the shirt incident, 2 of them covering the living room and kitchen. The timestamp showed nothing. Hours of empty rooms, furniture sitting undisturbed, shadows shifting only with the passage of headlights from the street below. No one had entered. No one had moved through that space. But the cups were there, real and solid when I picked them up, the porcelain cool against my palms. That night, I spoke aloud to the empty apartment. My voice sounded strange, too loud and too thin at the same time, swallowed by the silence that seemed to press in from all sides. "If something was there," I said, "if someone was trying to communicate, could they please find a less disturbing way? No more moving objects, no more mysterious arrangements. Something clear, something I could understand." The words felt ridiculous even as they left my mouth. The plea of a man standing alone in his living room at midnight, talking to furniture. But the alternative, that I was losing time, that my mind was fracturing in ways I couldn't perceive, felt worse. I went to bed. At exactly 2 a.m., 3 soft knocks echoed through the apartment. They came from my bedroom door, gentle but unmistakable. Tap, 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 then silence. I lay frozen under the sheets, my breath caught somewhere in my throat, every muscle locked tight. The darkness seemed to thicken around me, pressing down with physical weight. I waited for more sounds, footsteps, creaking floorboards, the whisper of movement, but nothing came. Just the watch, ticking beside my head, each second marked with mechanical precision. Eventually, I forced myself to move. Threw back the covers, crossed the room in 3 quick strides, and yanked open the door. The hallway was empty. I checked the cameras again, scrubbing through the footage with trembling hands. Nothing. No movement anywhere in the apartment. The timestamp showed 2 a.m., the exact moment I'd heard the knocking, and the living room sat still and undisturbed, the furniture casting familiar shadows across the floor. But when I walked into the living room to verify what I was seeing on screen, the curtains were closed. I'd left them open. I always left them open, drawn back to let in the morning light, tied with the fabric loops specifically designed for that purpose. Now they hung heavy and shut, the room dimmed to twilight even though dawn was approaching. The ties dangled loose, and when I examined them, I could see they'd been carefully undone, not torn or pulled free. Someone, something, had closed them from the inside while I slept. I stopped arguing with myself after that, stopped trying to rationalize. Instead, I adapted. Before bed, I began cleaning the apartment with obsessive thoroughness. Dishes washed and put away, clothes folded and stored, counters wiped down, everything in its place, arranged with the kind of order that felt like offering or appeasement. I didn't know which, and I tried not to think too hard about what it meant that I was doing it at all. The incidents didn't stop, but they changed. Some mornings I'd wake to find my books reorganized on the shelf, not alphabetically, but by color, creating a gradient that was actually quite beautiful in the early light. Other times, the remote control would migrate from the coffee table to the armrest of the couch, always positioned at the same precise angle. Small things, gentle things, as if whatever shared my space was trying to be helpful, or at least trying not to frighten me further. But the sensation of being watched never faded. It lived in the periphery of my vision, in the way shadows seem to hold shapes they shouldn't, in the odd acoustics of rooms that suddenly felt too large or too small. I'd turn my head quickly, trying to catch it, but there was never anything there, just empty space and the relentless ticking of the pocket watch. I tried getting rid of the watch once, took it to a pawn shop downtown, handed it over with relief flooding through my chest. The shopkeeper examined it with professional interest, commenting on the craftsmanship, the age. He offered me $200. I would have taken $20. But when I got home, the watch was back on my nightstand, positioned exactly where I always left it, ticking away as if it had never moved. I checked my bank account. The transaction had gone through. I still had the receipt in my wallet. The watch was in 2 places at once, or it had never left, or I'd never taken it to begin with. My memory felt increasingly unreliable, events layering over each other like photographs exposed multiple times. Had I actually gone to the pawn shop? Or had I only thought about it so vividly that the intention felt like action? I started losing time. Not dramatically. No sudden jumps from morning to evening. No waking up in strange places. Just small gaps, moments that should have been there but weren't. I'd be reading a page in a book and realize I couldn't remember the previous paragraph, even though my eyes had clearly scanned the words. I'd find myself standing in a room with no recollection of walking there, as if I'd blinked and teleported forward through my own life. The apartment began to feel like it was breathing. Not literally. I wasn't that far gone. Not yet. But there was a rhythm to it now, a sense of presence that rose and fell like respiration. The walls seemed to expand and contract in my peripheral vision. The air pressure changed without reason, my ears popping as if I'd climbed to altitude. Sometimes I'd catch a scent that didn't belong, coffee brewing when I hadn't made any, or that old tobacco smell from the tissue paper, drifting through rooms that should have smelled of nothing but dust and cleaning products. I tried talking to friends about it, casually, testing the waters. Mentioned that I'd been stressed lately, sleeping poorly, experiencing some odd things. Their responses were uniformly concerned and uniformly unhelpful. Suggestions for better sleep hygiene, recommendations for therapists, gentle implications that perhaps I was working too hard, drinking too much, not taking care of myself. No one wanted to hear about the impossible things. And maybe they were right. Maybe it was stress or a slow-motion breakdown or some neurological condition that manifested as misplaced objects and phantom sounds. The rational part of my mind, the part that still functioned during daylight hours, that went to work and paid bills and maintained a facade of normalcy, knew this was the most likely explanation. But the rational part grew quieter each night. Because the truth was, I'd started to find the presence comforting. The realization crept up slowly, shameful and strange. The apartment felt less empty with it there, less lonely. When I came home from work, there was an odd anticipation in my chest, a curiosity about what I might find. Books rearranged, a blanket folded on the couch. Once, I found all my pens organized by color in a perfect rainbow spread across my desk. And I'd laughed, actually laughed, the sound surprising me with its genuine delight. Whatever it was, it seemed to be trying to please me. The thought should have been terrifying. It was terrifying. But it was also the only companionship I'd had in months, maybe years. My life had narrowed to work and sleep. The same routines repeated until they'd worn grooves in my consciousness. I barely spoke to anyone anymore. Hadn't dated in over a year. My phone only rang for deliveries and spam calls. Here, at least, was something that noticed me, something that paid attention. I started leaving things for it. Small offerings, though I hated to think of them that way. A cup of coffee poured and left on the counter. A book opened to a page I thought it might enjoy. Once I set out 2 plates for dinner, dishing food onto both even though I ate alone, and in the morning the second plate was scraped clean and washed, sitting in the drying rack with a precision I could never quite manage. The boundaries of my reality blurred further. I'd catch myself having conversations in my head, long dialogues with an entity I couldn't name, couldn't see, couldn't prove existed, explaining my day, sharing thoughts, asking questions that never received answers, or at least, not in words. But the apartment responded. A window opened on stuffy days. Lights left on when I worked late, as if to welcome me home. My favorite mug always clean and ready by the coffee maker each morning. It was care, I realized. Clumsy and imperfect, sometimes unnerving, but care nonetheless. The cameras captured nothing, ever. I stopped checking them. What was the point? They showed only empty rooms while I lived in a space that felt increasingly crowded, occupied by something that existed in the gaps between seconds, in the moments when I blinked or turned away. 3 months after inheriting the watch, I found myself standing in the living room at 2 a.m., waiting. The knock came right on schedule. 3 soft taps, gentle and familiar now, less a disturbance than a greeting. I closed my eyes, listening to the silence that followed, feeling the weight of attention focused on me from somewhere I couldn't see. The pocket watch ticked on my nightstand, steady and patient, marking time that felt increasingly arbitrary. I thought about my uncle, alone in that big house, living with whatever he'd lived with. Whether he'd been haunted or mad or something in between, whether it mattered which was true. In the morning, I knew I'd find some new arrangement. Books moved or dishes cleaned or curtains adjusted. Evidence of presence or evidence of my own fracturing mind. I'd stopped being able to tell the difference. And standing there in the darkness, the apartment breathing around me, the watch ticking like a heartbeat, I realized with a clarity that felt like falling. I'd stopped wanting to know. Story 10. The fluorescent lights in the produce section hummed with that particular frequency that makes your teeth ache if you pay attention to it. I wasn't paying attention, not to the lights anyway. I was focused on the bruised avocados, trying to find one that might last until Thursday, when I heard my name. He stood 3 feet away, leaning against his cart, like it was the only thing keeping him upright. His work shirt hung loose on his frame, the company logo faded from too many washes. We'd worked together for 6 months before he transferred to the distribution center. Good enough guy. Shared the same cynicism about management, same dark humor about the job grinding us down to nothing. Rough morning? I asked, noting the shadows under his eyes, the way his skin had that grayish quality that speaks of too many double shifts. He laughed, but it sounded hollow, echoing strangely in the produce aisle despite the Saturday afternoon crowd. The sound seemed to hang in the air a moment too long. We traded the usual complaints, his supervisor micromanaging every pallet, my department getting slammed with last-minute inventory changes. Then he shifted to our football rivalry, the same comfortable argument we'd had a dozen times. His team had choked in the playoffs. Mine couldn't buy a competent quarterback. The conversation flowed with the easy rhythm of two people who'd spent too many break rooms together. But something felt off. The way he kept glancing over his shoulder, like he was expecting someone. The way his fingers gripped the cart handle, knuckles white with tension. When I mentioned he looked exhausted, he said something that stuck with me, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Yeah, man. Need to disconnect for a while. Shut everything down, you know." He paused, and his eyes had this distant quality, like he was looking through me at something far away. "Rest when you still can." The phrasing was odd, "when you still can," but I chalked it up to exhaustion. We said our goodbyes. His cart squeaked as he pushed it toward the dairy section, the sound fading gradually until the normal supermarket noise swallowed it completely. I finished shopping, drove home, put away groceries. Normal Saturday. The encounter slipped to the back of my mind until my phone buzzed around 9 that evening. The message came from Diana, who'd worked with both of us before transferring to HR. 3 words, "Call me, important." When I called, her voice carried that careful tone people use when they're about to deliver bad news. She asked if I'd heard about our former coworker. I said I'd actually run into him at the store that morning. The silence on her end stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "That's not possible," she finally said. "He's been in the hospital since last night. His wife found him collapsed in their bedroom around 11. He's in observation, stable, but they're running tests. He doesn't have his phone. They took it when he was admitted." The rational part of my brain immediately started working the problem. I'd misremembered the day, saw someone who looked like him. The store had been crowded. Maybe I'd confused him with another customer in similar work clothes, but I could picture him so clearly. The faded logo, the specific jokes he'd made about the quarterback controversy, that strange intensity when he said I should rest while I could. I told Diana I must have gotten the day mixed up. Saw him Friday, maybe. But even as I said it, I knew it was wrong. I'd gone to that store specifically because they ran weekend sales. I'd checked my phone while waiting in line, multiple times. Saturday, October 4th. The timestamp was right there in my memory, solid as concrete. Sleep came in fragments that night. Every time I drifted off, I'd jolt awake, convinced I'd heard that squeaking cartwheel in my hallway. In the grainy darkness, I kept replaying the conversation, searching for something that would explain it. Around 4 in the morning, I gave up and made coffee, standing at my kitchen window watching the street. The lampposts created pools of orange light at regular intervals. Between them, shadows accumulated in layers. That's when I started noticing the man across the street. He stood perfectly still under a tree, face obscured by the darkness and the angle. Watching my building, I told myself it was a neighbor walking their dog, but I never saw a dog, and he never moved. For 20 minutes I watched him watching my window until a delivery truck passed, and when it cleared, the space under the tree was empty. Sunday morning, I drove back to the supermarket. The manager on duty looked annoyed when I explained what I needed, that I'd lost my wallet. Thought maybe it fell from my pocket in the produce section yesterday around noon. Could I see the security footage just to check? He made me wait 40 minutes before grudgingly taking me to the small office behind customer service. The footage was grainy, shot from a ceiling-mounted camera that covered 3 aisles. He fast-forwarded to noon, then played it at normal speed. I watched myself enter the frame, examine avocados, my lips moving, talking to empty air. My head turned like I was listening to someone respond. I gestured toward the dairy section, laughed at nothing. But the angle was wrong, I told the manager. Could be someone just outside the frame. He pulled up the adjacent camera. Same story, me, alone, having an animated conversation with no one. The dairy section camera showed only other shoppers. No one matching his description anywhere in the store during that time window. Shopping carts did roll past occasionally, pushed by their owners. But in one section of footage, a cart moved through the frame with no one near it, just drifting slowly, that same squeaking wheel sound I remembered. The manager noticed my reaction and explained that the floor has an incline there. Carts sometimes roll if people don't engage the brake properly. Happens all the time. I went home and tried to rationalize it. Stress hallucination, carbon monoxide leak causing shared delusions, except I lived alone, and Diana hadn't mentioned seeing him. I scrolled through social media, found his wife's page. She'd posted asking for prayers, mentioning he'd been admitted Friday night with seizures. They were still running neurological tests. Nothing about visitors, nothing about him leaving. Monday at work, I kept my head down, trying to focus on inventory spreadsheets. Around 10, Bryant from shipping stopped by my desk. He asked if I'd heard about our old coworker being in the hospital. I said I had. Bryant shook his head and said it was crazy because he'd just seen him Friday afternoon at the gas station near the highway. They'd talked about football, about how brutal the job had been lately. Bryant swore he looked tired but otherwise normal. Friday? I asked. You're sure it was Friday? Bryant pulled out his phone, showed me his bank transaction history. Friday, 4:47 p.m., the gas station near Highway 9. He'd filled up right after talking to him. I suggested maybe Bryant had the day wrong, but he was adamant. He remembered because he'd been heading to his sister's birthday dinner, which was definitely Friday night. During lunch, I sat in my car and called the hospital, claimed to be a co-worker wanting to send flowers. The volunteer who answered confirmed he was still there, had been since late Friday night. No, he couldn't have visitors yet. Family only. Yes, he was conscious, but they were still running tests. Something about inconsistent brain activity. Tuesday, Elena from accounting mentioned seeing him Sunday morning at the coffee shop downtown. She'd waved, but he hadn't seemed to recognize her, just stared with that same distant expression. Wednesday, 2 people from different departments brought him up in conversation, each mentioning recent encounters. Each one impossible according to the hospital timeline. I stopped sleeping properly. Not insomnia exactly. I'd drift into something like sleep, but it felt thin, translucent. I'd be in my bed, but also somehow aware of the room around me, hyper-conscious of every sound. Footsteps in the apartment above became significant. The refrigerator's hum developed patterns, almost like Morse code. In those suspended states, I'd sometimes hear that cartwheel squeaking in the distance, growing closer, then fading before I could fully wake. Thursday morning I saw him again, or something that looked like him. I'd stopped for coffee before work, same place I always go. He sat in the corner booth, staring at an untouched cup. The morning light from the window behind him created a strange effect. I could see him clearly, but also somehow through him, like a double exposure. His lips moved constantly, soundlessly, in what might have been conversation with someone I couldn't see. I approached slowly. The closer I got, the more wrong it felt. The air around him seemed thicker, resistant. My coffee cup vibrated in my hand, liquid shivering in concentric circles. He looked up when I was 3 feet away, and his eyes had that same distant quality from the supermarket, but intensified, looking past me, through me. His mouth moved. No sound came out, but I understood the words anyway, felt them directly in my mind. Rest when you still can. I blinked and he was gone. Just gone. The booth was empty, the seat still indented as if recently occupied. I asked the barista if she'd seen the man in the corner. She looked at me strangely and said the booth had been empty all morning. She'd cleaned it herself when she opened at 6. My hand was shaking so badly I spilled coffee on my shirt. The barista offered napkins and asked if I was okay. I wasn't okay. I called in sick, drove home, and sat in my apartment trying to piece together what was happening. Shared psychosis? But these were isolated encounters. Different people, different locations, different times. No pattern except the impossible fact of his presence when he should have been hospitalized. That night I found the online forum, 3 a.m, deep in a rabbit hole of searches about collective hallucinations and shared visions. Someone had posted about seeing their neighbor everywhere, at the store, the library, walking past their house, while knowing the neighbor was in a coma. Other replies confirmed similar experiences. Loved ones appearing while critically ill. Friends showing up at impossible times. The thread devolved into arguments about astral projection and soul separation, pseudoscientific nonsense, until one comment stopped me cold. The user had a theory about consciousness during medical crises. How sometimes when the brain is fighting to stay functional during trauma or seizure or stroke, it broadcasts, sends out pieces of awareness that imprint on nearby people, create temporary echoes. Not ghosts, not spirits. Just fragments of confused consciousness looking for somewhere to exist while the body fights to stabilize. And these fragments, they don't know they're fragments. They go through familiar routines, have familiar conversations, gradually realizing something is wrong but unable to understand what. The post was 3 years old. No follow-up from the original poster. Friday, I forced myself back to work. Avoided the break room, avoided conversations. At lunch, I ate at my desk and searched for updates. His wife had posted that morning. They were moving him to a long-term care facility. The seizures had stopped, but he hadn't regained full consciousness. He existed in a state the doctors called minimal awareness. Eyes open, sometimes responsive to stimuli, but no coherent communication, no recognition of family. I thought about that phrase, minimal awareness, wondered what that meant from his perspective. If some part of him was trapped inside, screaming, while another part wandered the city having the same conversations, shopping for groceries he'd never eat, trying to maintain normalcy in whatever fragments of reality his damaged brain could construct. The weekend brought more sightings. Not me. I stayed home, door locked, blinds drawn, but social media lit up with tagged posts. People from work, from his old neighborhood, from the gym he used to attend, all mentioning casual encounters, all describing the same distant expression, the same sense of wrongness they couldn't articulate. Sunday night, someone posted a photo, taken outside the hospital apparently. A blurry figure stood near the entrance, facing the building. The image quality was poor, shot through a car window with streaks of rain distorting everything. But the posture was right. The build was right. The way he stood with slightly hunched shoulders, like he was carrying invisible weight. The caption asked if anyone else had seen him around the medical center. 3 people confirmed they had. One mentioned he'd been standing there for hours, unmoving, staring at the 3rd floor windows. That's where the long-term care unit was. I made myself coffee and thought about the security footage, me talking to empty air, about Bryant's gas station encounter, about Elena's coffee shop wave to someone who didn't respond. What if we were all seeing fragments, different pieces of fractured awareness, each playing out scenarios his damaged brain remembered or invented, each splinter convinced it was real, going through motions while the actual body lay motionless in a hospital bed? Or what if, and this thought came unwelcome in the dark hours, what if we were the fragments? What if I'd been in that hospital bed all along, and this entire week was my brain's desperate attempt to construct normalcy from scattered neural firing? What if my apartment, my job, my solid sense of reality, Were all just elaborate props my consciousness built to avoid confronting whatever truth waited behind the seizures? I stood at my window again, looking for the watching figure under the tree. The street was empty. Rain fell in sheets, turning the lamplight into smeared watercolor. My reflection in the glass looked unfamiliar, hollow-eyed, distant. My phone buzzed. Text from Diana. Several people reporting encounters. Did you see the hospital photo? This is getting weird. I started typing a response, then stopped. Looked at my hands on the phone screen. They trembled slightly, fingers moving with that peculiar delay you sometimes notice when exhausted. I wondered if Diana was real, if this phone was real, if any of it had ever been real, or if I'd been having a long conversation with shopping carts and empty booths and shadows under trees, my mind fragmenting while doctors ran tests and machines beeped in sterile rooms. The cartwheel sound returned, faint, squeaking somewhere in the distance, getting closer. I couldn't tell if it came from the hallway or from inside my own skull. My reflection in the window watched me with hollow eyes, and I couldn't remember when I'd last slept properly. Really slept. Not that thin, translucent drifting, but actual deep unconsciousness. Rest when you still can. The advice made sense now, carried a terrible logic. Rest before you fragment completely, before you spread yourself so thin across the city that you forget which version is real, before you're reduced to minimal awareness, wandering through familiar routines while strangers post blurry photos and wonder what they're seeing. The squeaking grew louder. I closed the blinds and sat in darkness, listening, waiting, unable to determine if the sound approached from outside my door or echoed from some damaged corner of my own consciousness, playing memories on an endless loop while my body lay somewhere else entirely, surrounded by the antiseptic smell and fluorescent hum of a hospital I might never leave. Tomorrow I'd go to work, have conversations, perform normalcy, and some part of me would wonder if the people I talked to were really there, or if we were all just fragments now, pieces of consciousness broadcasting our last familiar patterns before fading completely into whatever minimal awareness means. The cartwheel squeaked past my door, or inside my head. I couldn't tell anymore. I wasn't sure it mattered. Story 11. The farmhouse smelled of old wood and something else. Something like copper pennies left too long in a closed fist. I noticed it the moment the rental agent handed me the keys, her fingers withdrawing quickly as if the metal burned. She didn't meet my eyes when she mentioned the isolation would be perfect for writing, her words tumbling out too fast, too rehearsed. I'd driven 3 hours north from the city, watching civilization peel away like old wallpaper until only skeletal trees and sagging barns remained. The house sat at the end of a gravel road that seemed to narrow with each passing mile, as if the land itself were trying to squeeze me back out. It was exactly what I needed. No internet, no neighbors close enough to hear, no distractions from the manuscript that had been choking me for 8 months. The second floor held 3 bedrooms, though calling them that felt generous. Mine was the largest, with windows overlooking what might have once been an orchard, but now stood as a graveyard of twisted branches. The furniture was minimal, an iron bed frame that squeaked when I sat on it, a writing desk scarred with decades of initials and stains, a dresser with a mirror so foxed I could barely make out my own reflection. What caught my attention was the door. It stood in the far wall, painted over so many times the panels had lost their edges, becoming soft and rounded, like bones worn smooth by water. The doorknob was brass, tarnished nearly black except where countless hands had gripped it, leaving it polished to a dull gold. I tried it immediately. Locked. The agent hadn't mentioned a second room, and when I checked the hallway there was no corresponding entrance. The door opened somewhere that existed only from my side. The lockbox on the kitchen counter held a single brass key on a loop of frayed ribbon. It fit perfectly. The room beyond was smaller, windowless, the air inside thick and stale as if it had been holding its breath. A child's bed frame stood against one wall, stripped of its mattress. A rocking chair faced the corner, its seat worn concave from use. Nothing else. The walls were bare plaster, water-stained in patterns that looked almost deliberate, shapes that suggested movement, figures caught mid-gesture. I stood in the doorway for what felt like minutes, unable to step inside, feeling the air pressure change as if the room were breathing. I locked it, turned the key twice to be sure. That first night, I worked until my eyes burned, the manuscript finally flowing in the silence broken only by the house settling around me. Those peculiar groans and creaks that old buildings make, as if complaining about the weight of all those years. I didn't notice when the temperature dropped, not until my breath began to fog. The radiators were off. I checked twice. Sleep came hard, my mind still churning with half-finished sentences and plot threads that refused to knit together. I'd positioned the bed so I faced away from that door, but I felt it there, a presence at my back like someone standing too close in a crowded train. The darkness behind my eyelids felt thinner than it should, more permeable. I woke to pre-dawn gray and cold air moving across my face. The door stood open, not just unlocked, wide open, the space beyond a rectangle of deeper darkness that seemed to pull at the weak morning light. My chest constricted, breath catching somewhere between my lungs and throat. I hadn't heard it. Hadn't heard anything. I sat up slowly, the bed frame shrieking, and my foot struck something hard. The wooden trunk I'd noticed downstairs sat at the foot of my bed. I'd left it in the front hall, full of old moth-eaten blankets. It now stood upright, lid open, empty, except for that smell, copper and something organic, like soil from a grave. I spent 20 minutes checking the windows, the locks, the doors, everything sealed. The key to that door lay on my nightstand where I'd left it. I picked it up, feeling how cold the metal had become, how it seemed to vibrate faintly in my palm like a tuning fork struck too softly to hear. Logic suggested several explanations. I'd sleepwalked, though I never had before. The lock was faulty. The door had simply swung open from a draft. The trunk, well, perhaps I'd moved it myself without remembering, carrying it up in some fugue state of exhaustion and creative obsession. Writers were known for their strange habits, their disconnection from the physical world when deep in the work. But logic couldn't explain why my hands shook as I closed that door again, or why I dragged the heavy trunk across the floor and wedged it against the frame, or why I spent the rest of the morning watching it instead of writing. The second night, I prepared differently. I scattered books across the floor between my bed and that door, heavy hardcovers that would crash and wake me if anyone tried to cross. I set a water glass on the trunk, filled to the brim, so any movement would spill it. I left my laptop open, recording video of the door, the battery indicator showing 8 hours of charge. Then I forced myself to write, to lose myself in the story I'd come here to finish. The words came easier now, perhaps because some part of my mind had surrendered to this place, had stopped resisting its particular atmosphere. I wrote about doors that opened onto impossible rooms, about houses that remembered things best forgotten, about the weight of history pressing down on thin walls and thinner minds. When exhaustion finally pulled me under, I dreamed of footsteps, not heavy boots or running feet, but something light, patient, methodical. The sound of someone who had all the time in the world, who had been waiting so long that time had become meaningless. Morning came too bright, too sudden. The books were gone. Not scattered. Gone. I searched the bedroom, thinking perhaps I'd hallucinated placing them there, that my fatigue had finally crossed into delirium. The trunk remained against the door, but the water glass sat empty and bone dry, as if it had been that way for years. The door itself stood closed, locked, the key still on my nightstand. I found the books on the covered porch, stacked in a neat tower that swayed slightly in the morning wind. 5 hardcovers I'd definitely placed inside, their covers beaded with dew. And one, American Gothic, Architecture and Terror, sat inside the barn, balanced on a rusted hay hook 20 feet from the ground. The laptop's battery had died at 3:47 a.m. The last frame showed my room in infrared, the door closed, everything still. Then nothing. I should have left then, packed my things, driven back to the city, found another place to work. But something had changed in me during the night, something I couldn't quite name. The manuscript was pouring out now, the words coming faster than I could type them. And wasn't that why I'd come here? For the isolation, the focus, the ability to sink so deep into the work that nothing else mattered. The village sat 3 miles down the road, barely more than a cluster of buildings around a crossroads. A general store, a post office, a white clapboard church with a cemetery stretching up the hill behind it. I drove there that afternoon, telling myself I needed supplies, though what I really needed were other human faces, voices, confirmation that the world beyond the farmhouse still existed. The woman at the store, elderly, wearing an apron that might have been white decades ago, watched me gather coffee and bread with eyes that seemed to know exactly where I was staying. When I asked about the farmhouse, her expression went carefully blank. The church was unlocked, its interior cool and dim and smelling of old hymnals and furniture polish. I found the records in a back room, filing cabinets labeled by decade going back to the 1800s. The parish secretary, if she existed, was nowhere to be seen. The entry was handwritten on yellowed paper, filed under incidents rather than deaths or accidents. An unfortunate fall on the stairs, January 1952. No name, no other details. But at the bottom, in different ink, shakier handwriting, "Do not leave it open at night." My hands trembled as I photographed the page, the camera struggling to focus in the weak light. I should have asked questions. Who wrote this? What did it mean? What happened in that house? But the silence in that church felt too heavy, too watchful, and I found myself backing out of the records room, out of the building, into air that tasted thin and insufficient. Back at the farmhouse, the afternoon sun slanted through the windows at angles that seemed wrong, casting shadows that didn't quite align with their sources. I stood in my bedroom doorway, staring at that closed door, at the trunk still wedged against it, at the key lying on the nightstand like an accusation. I picked up the key, opened the door. The small room looked exactly as it had before, empty except for the stripped bed frame and rocking chair. But something had changed. The water stains on the walls had spread, or perhaps they'd always been that extensive and I simply hadn't noticed. They formed shapes now, unmistakable shapes. Handprints climbing the walls, small handprints ascending from floor to ceiling in a spiral pattern that made my stomach lurch. No, not handprints. The rational part of my mind insisted on this. Water damage, pareidolia, the human tendency to find patterns in randomness. I'd been alone too long, sleeping too little, letting the isolation in this house's atmosphere infect my perception. But I couldn't stop staring at those marks, couldn't stop counting them. 23 sets of prints climbing the walls, each one slightly smaller than the last, as if whatever made them was shrinking, compressing, folding itself into something that could fit into smaller and smaller spaces. The rocking chair moved, just once, just the tiniest shift, as if someone had stood up from it a moment before I looked. The seat still bore an indentation. I slammed the door, locked it, pocketed the key. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I could feel it in my throat, my vision tunneling at the edges. Panic attack. Just a panic attack brought on by stress and isolation and too many nights of insufficient sleep. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to count backwards from 10, to employ all the techniques I'd learned years ago when anxiety had nearly derailed my first book. The sun set while I stood there, breathing, counting, trying to convince myself I was fine. That night, I didn't prepare barriers or recording devices. I sat at the desk and wrote with a fever that felt like possession, the words flowing through me rather than from me. The story had taken on a life of its own, had become something I was discovering rather than creating. It wrote itself about this house, about that door, about the terrible weight of events that had soaked into the walls and floor and air itself, becoming part of the structure's very foundation. At some point, I became aware of a sound, soft, rhythmic, almost soothing, creaking, back and forth, with the patience of something that had been doing it for decades. The rocking chair. I could hear it through the door, through the wood and plaster and all my desperate attempts at denial. Back and forth, back and forth. The sound of someone waiting, Someone who had been waiting so long they'd forgotten what they were waiting for, but knew they couldn't stop. I kept writing. What else could I do? The manuscript was almost finished now, the end in sight, and if I stopped, if I acknowledged what I was hearing, what I knew was happening in that room, I'd have to leave, and the story would remain unfinished, and I would never know how it ended. The temperature dropped until I could see my breath, until frost began to form on the inside of the windows in patterns that looked like fingers pressed against glass. The rocking chair creaked. My fingers flew across the keyboard. Something was building, some terrible convergence between what I was writing and what was happening in this house, as if the act of putting words to paper was giving form to something that had previously existed only as potential, as possibility, as a door that shouldn't be opened. I typed the last sentence at 3:47 a.m. The rocking chair stopped. The silence that followed felt worse than the sound, felt like the inhalation before a scream, the pause before the fall. I sat frozen, staring at the screen, at the words I'd written, a story about a writer who came to a farmhouse to finish a book and slowly realized he wasn't alone, that something in that house had been waiting for someone like him, someone isolated enough, desperate enough, focused enough to serve as a bridge between what was and what wanted to be. The door opened. I didn't turn around. Couldn't turn around. I stared at my reflection in the dark window, watching the doorway behind me fill with a deeper darkness, a darkness that seemed to breathe and shift and move with purpose. In the glass, I could almost make out a shape, small, patient, waiting. How long had I been here? Days? Weeks? The calendar on my phone showed dates that couldn't be right, showed time passing in chunks and gaps that made no sense. The manuscript on my screen ran to hundreds of pages, more than I could have possibly written in the time I remembered being here. Or perhaps I'd been here much longer than I knew. Perhaps that first night, when the door opened and I woke to gray light and displaced furniture, something had already changed. Perhaps I'd already fallen, tumbled down stairs that existed only between wake and sleep, between reality and whatever lay on the other side of that door. The darkness behind me shifted, and I felt rather than heard a whisper, words that might have been thank you or your turn or don't leave it open. I closed my laptop. The room plunged into darkness except for the faint glow of my phone. 3:47 a.m. The numbers unchanging, frozen, as if time itself had decided to wait and see what I would do. Slowly, so slowly, I turned around. The door stood open. The small room beyond was no longer empty. The rocking chair sat occupied now, a depression in the seat, arms resting on the armrests, though I could see nothing but shadow and the suggestion of shape. On the walls, the handprints had multiplied, climbing and spiraling until they covered every surface, ascending toward a ceiling I could no longer see, as if the room had grown impossibly tall, impossibly deep, a shaft descending into earth or time or memory. And on the floor, between the doorway and that occupied chair, lay a neat stack of books. My books, the ones I'd scattered to protect myself. But not just those. Other books too. Older books. Their covers cracked and faded. Titles in languages I didn't recognize. On top of the stack sat a single sheet of yellowed paper covered in shaky handwriting. I knew what it would say before I read it. Knew what I was supposed to do. Knew that I was no longer writing the story but had become part of it. Another entry in the parish records. Another unfortunate incident. Another warning that no one would heed. Do not leave it open at night. But it was already open. Had been open since that first morning, perhaps. Had been open for years, decades, waiting for someone like me. Someone isolated enough, desperate enough, willing to sacrifice anything to finish their work. The manuscript was complete. The book was done. The price was yet to be determined. Outside, the first birds began to sing, their voices thin and distant, as if coming from a world I'd already left behind. The darkness in the doorway shifted again, patient, waiting, and I understood with terrible clarity that I had a choice to make. Not whether to leave or stay, but whether what I chose would matter at all. I stood up from the desk. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet. And somewhere in the house, other floorboards answered, above me, below me, all around me, as if the entire structure were waking up, taking notice. The rocking chair began to move again, back and forth, waiting to see what I would do, waiting to see if I would close the door, or if I would finally, after all this time, step through. Story 12. The fog doesn't roll in along that stretch of coastal highway. It emerges. It seeps from the cliff face like breath from stone lungs, thick and deliberate, pooling in the curves where the road bends closest to the drop. That's where I first saw her, 3 weeks ago, when my partner screamed for me to swerve. The hazard lights cast orange pulses across wet asphalt as I stood outside the car, flashlight cutting weak paths through the mist. My partner remained inside, hands pressed against the dashboard, still breathing hard from the shock. I'd called out to ask if she was certain about what she'd seen, and she'd nodded without looking at me, her eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. I walked the shoulder, gravel crunching under my boots, the beam of my flashlight revealing nothing but fog and the guardrail's reflection. Then I found them, the marks. Rectangular impressions in the asphalt, 4 parallel tracks maybe 8 inches apart, pressed deep enough to catch water. They ran in a straight line down the shoulder, ending abruptly 20 feet before the curve, as if whatever made them had simply lifted off the ground. Hospital gurney wheels. I knew the pattern from too many late-night visits to emergency rooms during my father's final months. The spacing was exact, the depth suggesting weight, though the marks themselves appeared old, weathered at the edges, filled with the kind of grime that takes seasons to accumulate. When I returned to the car, my partner was calmer. She described what she'd seen. A woman in white, pushing an empty gurney along the shoulder, moving against traffic, staring straight ahead. The figure had been solid, real, close enough that swerving had felt necessary. But when I'd stopped and looked back, nothing remained except fog and those wheel marks ending at nothing. We drove home in silence. I wanted to dismiss it, to chalk it up to fog and shadows and the tricks headlights play at night. But 2 days later, I found myself taking the coastal route home from work instead of the inland highway. The detour added 20 minutes. I told myself I was just curious. The pullout appeared in my headlights like a secret revealed. A small rectangular space cut into the cliff wall, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles. I'd driven this road dozens of times and never noticed it. The pavement there was older, patched and repatched, the surface worn smooth in places where tires had turned repeatedly. Along the back wall, metal hooks jutted from the rock face, spaced evenly at shoulder height, rusted but sturdy. The kind of hooks that might hold equipment, or stretchers, or bags of supplies. I parked and got out. The ocean sound was different here, muffled somehow, as if the cliff itself absorbed the waves. My footsteps echoed wrong in the enclosed space. When I touched one of the hooks, orange rust flaked onto my fingers, but beneath it the metal felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. That's when I noticed the fog beginning to move. Not drifting, moving. It flowed toward the pullout from both directions, converging, and as it did, it began to clear a space. A corridor, approximately 6 feet wide, running from the pullout down the shoulder toward the curve where the wheel marks ended. I stood at the edge of this cleared path, the fog walls on either side so dense they seemed solid, and I understood with absolute certainty that if I stepped into that corridor, something would happen. Something would meet me there. I got in my car and drove away. My hands shook on the wheel, but understanding didn't stop me from returning. The coastal route became my regular commute. Each night I'd slow near the pullout, sometimes stopping, sometimes just slowing enough to see if the fog would part again. It did, every time, always at dusk, always the same dimensions. The corridor waited, patient and empty. My partner noticed my new route. She asked why I was adding time to my drive, why I came home later now. I told her the coastal road helped me think, gave me time to decompress. She accepted this with a look that said she didn't believe me but wouldn't push. We'd been together 5 years. She knew when I needed space. But space wasn't what I needed. I needed to understand. I started researching the area. County records showed the pullout dated back to the 1950s, originally designated as an emergency services staging area. Before the main hospital opened inland, coastal accidents had been common. Cars going over the cliff, boats capsizing, hikers falling. Ambulances used to wait there, especially during storms, ready to respond. The practice ended in 1967 when a new highway bypass opened and the coastal route became secondary. Nothing in the records explained the woman in white or the wheel marks or the way the fog behaved like something living. But I found something else. A mention in a 1966 newspaper article about emergency responders experiencing unusual psychological stress along that section of highway. No details, just a brief reference in a piece about improved working conditions for ambulance crews. I became obsessed with finding more. I drove there every evening, sometimes sitting in the pullout for an hour, watching the corridor form in the fog. The cleared path never changed width or position. It maintained its exact dimensions, roughly the size of a gurney with a person walking alongside. Sometimes I thought I could hear wheels on asphalt, that distinctive rattle of casters over pavement. But whenever I held my breath to listen, the sound disappeared. 3 weeks after the first sighting, I finally stepped into the corridor. The fog closed behind me immediately, cutting off my view of the car, the road, everything. The cleared path remained ahead, precise and narrow, and the temperature dropped so fast my breath came out in clouds. The sound of the ocean vanished. No wind, no distant traffic, just the fog walls pressing in and the dark asphalt under my feet. I walked forward, each step feeling like a decision I couldn't unmake. The corridor stretched ahead, impossibly long, though I knew from pacing it during daylight that the distance from pullout to curve was maybe 200 feet. I should have reached the end in under a minute, but I walked for what felt like 10 without the corridor changing. That's when I heard the wheels. Behind me, the rhythmic rattle of casters, steady and unhurried. I turned, and there she was. The woman in white wasn't old, but she looked exhausted in a way that went deeper than age. Her uniform was pristine except for the hem, which was darkened with something that might have been mud or water stains. She pushed the gurney with practiced ease, her hands positioned exactly where hands should be, her gait mechanical and smooth. She didn't look at me. She looked through me, past me, toward something I couldn't see. I stepped aside to let her pass, pressing myself against the fog wall. It felt solid against my back, cold and damp, but resistant, like pressing against wet canvas. She moved past me without acknowledgement, the gurney wheels leaving fresh marks on the asphalt, marks I could see forming in real time, deep and dark and deliberate. The gurney was empty, but the mattress was depressed in the center, as if bearing weight. I followed her. I don't know why. Maybe because turning back felt more terrifying than moving forward. She maintained her steady pace, never speeding up or slowing down, never looking back. The corridor continued ahead of her, the fog parting just enough to accommodate her passage, closing behind us both. We walked for minutes or hours. Time felt negotiable there, unreliable. My legs ached, but I couldn't stop. I tried calling out to her once, asking where she was going, but my voice sounded muffled and small, and she gave no indication she'd heard. Then the corridor ended. Not at the curve where the wheel marks had stopped in the real world, but at a different place entirely, a space that shouldn't exist. It was another pullout, larger than the first, carved deeper into the cliff face. The back wall was lined with gurneys, dozens of them, all empty, all pristine. The same metal hooks lined the walls, but here they held things. Clipboards with yellowed papers, coiled tubes and wires, oxygen masks with cracked rubber, equipment from decades past, preserved perfectly, waiting. The woman in white rolled her gurney into an open space along the wall and positioned it with practiced precision. Then she turned and walked past me, back into the corridor, her expression unchanged, her pace steady. I watched her disappear into the fog. I was alone in that impossible space, surrounded by empty gurneys and antique equipment, the fog pressing in from the corridor entrance. I could feel eyes on me, not watching exactly, but aware. The gurneys all faced outward, toward me, and though they were empty, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were occupied, that if I looked at them differently, or from another angle, I'd see what was really there. I ran, back through the corridor, the fog walls seeming to grab at my jacket, my breath coming in gasps that fogged the air even thicker. I expected the path to go on forever, to trap me there, but suddenly I burst out into the original pullout, stumbling against my car, my hands slapping metal that felt blessedly real and solid. I drove home going 20 over the limit, checking my rearview mirror constantly. The coastal road behind me looked normal, fog and curves and darkness, nothing more. That was 2 weeks ago. I've been taking the inland route since then, the highway that adds no time to my commute, the route that doesn't pass the pullout, or the wheel marks, or the place where the fog parts like a door opening. But tonight, sitting at my desk with my partner asleep in the next room, I pulled up a satellite image of the coastal highway. I zoomed in on the section where the pullout sits, where the corridor forms each evening, where I walked into that impossible space. The pullout is there on the satellite image, exactly where I remember it. But the image is dated, captured during daytime 3 months ago. And in the pullout, clearly visible in the overhead shot, is a vehicle. An old ambulance, white paint faded to gray, parked at an angle against the cliff wall. I've driven past that pullout dozens of times in daylight since returning. There's never been an ambulance there. The space has always been empty, except for those hooks and that old pavement. I enlarged the image until pixels broke apart, trying to see details. The ambulance appears occupied, a dark shape in the driver's seat, another in the back. Or maybe it's just shadows. Maybe it's compression artifacts or lens flares or any of a dozen rational explanations. But when I look at the road in front of the ambulance in the satellite image, I can see them. Faint but visible. The wheel marks, running from the ambulance, down the shoulder, ending at nothing before the curve. My partner calls from the bedroom asking if I'm coming to bed. I tell her soon, just finishing some work. My voice sounds normal. Everything sounds normal. I close the satellite image and open my calendar. Tomorrow I have meetings until 6. After that, if I take the coastal route, I'll reach the pullout right around dusk, right when the fog emerges and the corridor opens. I should take the inland highway. I should delete my research, stop looking at satellite images, forget that impossible space with its waiting gurneys and watchful emptiness. But my hand moves without conscious thought, adding an appointment to my calendar. Coastal route home, 7 p.m. Because here's what I haven't told anyone, what I can barely admit to myself. When I was in that space, standing among those empty gurneys with the fog pressing in, I felt something. Recognition. Like coming home after a long absence. Like remembering something I'd forgotten. And when I burst out into the real pullout and drove away, I checked my rearview mirror constantly, not because I was afraid of what might follow me. I checked because I was afraid of what might be waiting for my return. The fog outside my window tonight is thicker than usual. It moves against the glass in patterns that look almost deliberate, almost purposeful. I watch it form corridors in the streetlight glow, clearing paths between parked cars, opening spaces just wide enough for something to pass through. My partner's breathing is steady and deep from the bedroom. She's dreaming, safe, anchored to this reality by sleep and certainty. But I'm awake, watching the fog, feeling those hooks still cold against my fingertips, hearing wheels that rattle just below the threshold of sound. Tomorrow evening I'll drive the coastal route. I'll stop at the pullout. And if the corridor opens, when the corridor opens, I'll step into it again. Because the truth I can't escape is this. I don't know if that woman in white was real, or if she's something my mind created to explain what it can't comprehend. I don't know if that impossible space exists in the world, or only in my perception of it. I don't know if I'm documenting something supernatural or witnessing my own gradual disconnection from reality. But I know I'm going back. I have to. Not despite the uncertainty, but because of it. The fog shifts outside, and for just a moment, I see it. A corridor. The exact width of a gurney with someone walking alongside. It runs from my window across the street, clear and precise, ending at nothing. I close my laptop and sit in the darkness, watching that impossible path, feeling the hooks cold still on my fingers, hearing wheels that may or may not be there. And I wait for tomorrow evening, when I can find out which version of myself is real, the one sitting here now, or the one who belongs in that space among the empty gurneys, waiting for something I used to know how to do. The fog corridor outside holds steady, patient, like it has all the time in the world, like it knows I'm already gone. Story 13. The fluorescent lights in the executive floor's break room hummed with that particular frequency that makes your teeth ache if you listen too long. I'd learned not to listen. 23 floors up in the Charlotte Tower, doing overnight maintenance when the suits were safely home, you develop strategies. Don't think about the empty halls. Don't wonder why the motion sensors never seem to trigger when you're alone. Don't check the access logs too carefully. That last one broke me. It started simple enough. The TV mounted above the kitchenette counter had been left on, some financial channel cycling through after-hours programming to an audience of empty leather chairs. Protocol said power down all non-essential electronics during maintenance windows. Insurance liability, energy costs, the usual corporate reasoning that makes sense in daylight but feels thin at 11:42 p.m. when you're the only breathing thing on the floor. I reached up and pressed the power button. The screen went black, and in that black mirror, something looked back. The reflection wasn't mine. Behind where my shoulder should have been, there was a woman. The image lasted perhaps 2 seconds, long enough for my brain to catalog details it didn't want. Skin the color of printer paper left too long in the sun, hair cropped short, practical, the kind of cut you'd see on any office worker. But the smile, God, the smile was all wrong, too wide, too fixed, like someone had explained the concept of smiling, but missed some crucial element of what makes an expression human. I spun around. The break room stretched empty behind me. Vending machines hummed their constant song. The coffee maker's digital clock blinked 11:42 in angry red numbers. Through the glass walls, the cubicle farm spread out in geometric precision. Each workstation exactly like the last, all bathed in that sickly emergency lighting that never fully illuminates or fully conceals. My heart hammered against my ribs with enough force to bruise. I counted to 10, breathing through my nose the way the company wellness program suggested during their mandatory stress management seminar. The irony wasn't lost on me. When I turned back to the TV, my own reflection stared back, alone, pale, startled. Just me and the fluorescent hum and 23 floors of expensive carpet between me and the street. I should have left then. Instead, I did what any underpaid IT contractor does when confronted with the inexplicable. I rationalized. Trick of the light. Sleep deprivation. I'd been pulling these overnight shifts for 3 weeks straight. Maybe something on the screen had remained visible for a moment. Some residual image my tired brain interpreted as a face. The mind sees patterns. Faces in clouds, figures in static. Basic psychology. I moved to the refrigerator to check if anyone had left food to rot over the weekend. Company policy required us to clear perishables during maintenance rounds. I pulled the handle. The smile was waiting in the glass door. Not a face. Just the smile. Reflected in the refrigerator's surface, suspended at shoulder height where no face existed. A crescent of white that couldn't have been teeth but somehow was. The same too wide curve, the same wrongness, hanging in space like someone had cut a piece from reality and pasted it slightly off-center. I slammed the door shut. The sound echoed through the empty floor, bouncing off glass walls and ergonomic furniture and professional development posters about synergy and innovation. No one called out to ask what was wrong. No one came to investigate the noise, because according to the access logs I'd reviewed before starting my rounds, no one had badged into this floor since 9 p.m. The system tracked every entry and exit with timestamp precision. I was the only authorized presence. The only person who should be here. Should be. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone, opened the building security app. The access log confirmed what I already knew. One entry at 9:47 p.m. My badge number, my credential, alone. I looked back at the refrigerator. Through the glass, I could see the normal contents. Someone's forgotten yogurt, a bag of takeout containers, a few energy drinks. No smile, no reflection that shouldn't exist. Just ordinary break room debris waiting for Monday morning. The rest of my shift passed in a blur of mechanical actions. I checked servers, ran diagnostics, updated software, performed every task on my checklist with the focused intensity of someone trying very hard not to think. The executive floor remained stubbornly empty, stubbornly normal, stubbornly humming with that fluorescent frequency that made my teeth ache. I left at 6 a.m. when the early risers started arriving, nodding to the first executives without making eye contact, taking the elevator down with my equipment bag clutched too tightly and my eyes fixed on the descending floor numbers. Daylight helped. Coffee helped more. By the time I reached my apartment, I'd almost convinced myself it was fatigue, stress, the natural consequence of too many nights in artificial light. Almost. But that night, lying in bed with traffic sounds filtering through my window and real darkness pressing against the glass, I couldn't stop thinking about the access logs, about the absolute certainty of the system, about being provably, verifiably alone, about what it meant that I wasn't. The next evening, I returned to the executive floor with a camera, not my work equipment, something personal, a decent digital camera I'd bought years ago in a brief photography phase that never quite took. I set it up in the break room, angled toward the TV, and let it record. Then I went about my maintenance routine, checking every 30 minutes to ensure the red recording light still blinked its steady confirmation. The night passed without incident. No reflections, no smiles. Just the usual symphony of humming electronics and air conditioning and the settling sounds that tall buildings make. I almost felt foolish, packing up the camera at shift's end, already composing the self-deprecating story I'd tell myself about paranoia and overwork. I reviewed the footage the next morning, sitting at my kitchen table with too much coffee and not enough sleep. The video was perfect, crystal clear. 8 hours of continuous recording, the timestamp in the corner advancing with metronomic precision. I watched myself move through the frame at intervals, performing my rounds. The TV stayed dark, the break room stayed empty, but there was no audio, not silence. Silence would have been a negative space, an absence. This was something else. The file had an audio track. The waveform showed activity, compression artifacts, the normal signatures of recorded sound. But when I played it back, nothing emerged. Not the fluorescent hum, not my footsteps, not the ambient noise that fills every space, the acoustic proof that reality is happening. It was as if sound itself had refused to be captured, as if the microphone had recorded fear instead of frequencies. I checked the camera's settings. Audio input, enabled, volume, maximum, format, standard. I played other videos I'd recorded, birthday parties, a concert, random test footage. All played normally, sound and image synchronized perfectly. Only the executive floor footage was silent. I spent the next week trying to rationalize this too. Electromagnetic interference from the servers, some quirk of the building's construction affecting the audio, a corrupted file, a camera malfunction that coincidentally occurred during that specific 8-hour window. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the silence was intentional, that something had allowed itself to be seen, by camera, by my eyes, but refused to be heard, as if sound would have given something away, made it too real, too present, too provable. The maintenance shifts continued. I kept working the executive floor because the overnight differential paid 30% more than day shifts, and my student loans didn't care about paranormal experiences. But I developed new protocols. Never turn off the TV without first checking the reflection. Never open the refrigerator without counting to 3. Never, ever check the access logs too carefully. That last one became harder, because over the following weeks I started noticing discrepancies. Small ones. My badge-in time would be logged 5 minutes before I'd actually arrived. Sometimes the log showed me accessing conference rooms I'd never entered. Once, the system recorded an exit at 3:22 a.m., a time when I'd been verifiably on the 18th floor, witnessed by another contractor doing rounds. I mentioned it to building security. They pulled up the logs, compared them against CCTV footage, found no anomalies. According to them, everything matched perfectly. The timestamp errors I'd seen must have been display glitches, browser caching issues, the normal friction between database and interface. But I'd screenshot the discrepancies. I had evidence of the errors. And when I showed them, security looked at my images, looked at their current logs, and I could see them thinking the same thing I was thinking, but none of us wanted to say. Someone had changed the logs after I'd viewed them, or something. The distinction started to matter less. I began seeing her, it more frequently, or never fully, never in a way that let me get a clear look. A shoulder rounding a corner just as I arrived. A silhouette behind frosted glass that disappeared when I opened the door. Once, in an empty conference room, I found a chair still warm, the leather holding the ghost heat of someone who'd been sitting moments before. The access log showed no one else on the floor. I stopped sleeping well, started arriving at work already exhausted, maintaining systems in a fog of caffeine and dread. My supervisor noticed, asked if everything was okay. I told him I was fine, just adjusting to the overnight schedule, and watched his expression carefully for any sign that he knew, that he'd experienced this too, that I wasn't the first contractor to see things in reflections and find impossible warmth in empty rooms. He looked concerned, suggested I take a few days off, maybe switch back to day shifts if the overnight work was wearing on me. I agreed to consider it, but I didn't switch. I didn't take time off, because by then, I needed to know. Last week, I broke protocol completely. During my shift alone at 2 a.m., I walked through the entire executive floor, turning off every light. Emergency lighting cast everything in amber and shadow, creating a landscape of half visibility where nothing was quite certain. I stood in the middle of the cubicle farm and waited. She appeared within minutes. Not in a reflection this time, not in glass or polished surfaces. She was simply there, standing between two workstations, lit by the emergency lighting's glow. Same pale skin, same short hair, same smile that my brain still couldn't process as human, despite looking directly at it. We stared at each other across 40 feet of corporate carpet. I wanted to speak, wanted to demand answers, to ask what she was and what she wanted, and why the building's security systems couldn't see her. But my throat had closed, my voice stolen by the same force that had silenced my camera's audio. She didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there smiling that wrong smile, and I understood with sudden, terrible clarity that she'd been here the whole time. Not haunting the floor, not manifesting periodically. She'd been here every night, every shift, walking these halls while I worked, standing behind me while I typed passwords and ran diagnostics and trusted that the access logs proved my solitude. The logs that showed only me. The logs that couldn't see her, wouldn't see her. Because she wasn't unauthorized. She wasn't breaching security or bypassing badge readers. She belonged here in a way that preceded access control systems and emergency lighting and the construction of the building itself. She was part of the infrastructure, part of what made this place run. And the building's security did exactly what it was designed to do. It protected her presence by denying it existed. I turned the lights back on. She was gone. The cubicles stood empty, arranged in their precise grid. The motion sensors that should have triggered from her movement registered nothing unusual. According to every system, every sensor, every log, I'd been alone the entire time. I completed my shift, packed my equipment, badged out at 6 a.m. But before I left, I checked the access logs one final time. 2 entries, 2 exits, same timestamps, same badge number. Mine. I still work the overnight maintenance shifts. The pay is good, and bills need to be paid. And there are worse things than sharing your workspace with something that shouldn't exist. I've developed strategies. Don't turn off the TV without preparing yourself. Don't open the refrigerator without accepting what you might see. Don't check the access logs expecting them to tell the truth. and never ever try to record her voice, because some things allow themselves to be seen. Some things tolerate witnesses, accept observers, permit themselves to be partially known. But sound would make her too real. Sound would mean she could call out, could speak, could make demands or ask questions or confirm beyond any rationalization that she's there. And we both know, she and I, locked in our overnight coexistence, that I'm not ready for that truth. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But every shift, alone according to the logs that lie, I feel her behind me. See her in reflections that cameras capture but refuse to prove. And I wonder how many others share their workspace with the things that security systems cannot see. How many of us are provably, verifiably, systemically alone, while never actually being alone at all. The fluorescent lights hum their constant song. The access logs record their careful fiction. And somewhere on the executive floor, in the space between light and reflection, she smiles that too wide smile. Waiting. Always waiting. For what? I still don't know. But I suspect I'll find out eventually. We have all the time in the world, don't we?